Chapter 1. An Invitation to Thornfield. The invitation to Thornfield Hall arrived on a particularly dismal Tuesday in late May, when the rain had been falling in sheets since dawn, rendering my small garden in St. Mary Mead rather forlorn. I had been seated by the window of my cottage, knitting a pale blue scarf for my grandnephew Raymond's birthday, and observing with some satisfaction how the raindrops trembled on the petals of my newly blooming Canterbury bells, when my housekeeper, Cherry Baker, brought in the post on a small silver tray. "Special delivery, Miss Marple," she said, her young face bright with curiosity. "Hand-delivered by a chauffeur, if you please. Most elegant automobile I've ever seen, all polished and gleaming despite the weather." I set aside my knitting and adjusted my spectacles, taking the cream-colored envelope with interest. It was of the finest quality, the address written in an elegant, flowing hand that I recognized immediately as belonging to my dear friend Dolly Bantry. "How curious," I remarked, carefully opening the envelope with my silver letter opener. Mrs. Bantry mentioned she would be visiting relatives in Thornfield, but I hadn't expected to hear from her so soon. The letter inside was written on heavy, monogram stationery, the elaborate B at the top certainly not Dolly's own, but rather that of her host's. "My dearest Jane, I simply must insist that you join me at Thornfield Hall without delay. The Blackwoods have been the most generous hosts, but something troubling is afoot that I believe would benefit from your particular insights. Lord Richard has assembled what is undoubtedly the finest private collection of botanical specimens in England, including numerous varieties one might classify as deadly beautiful. To borrow a phrase from the rather unsettling Professor Montgomery, who arrived 2 days ago to study said collection. An engagement party for the Blackwood's daughter, Sophia, is scheduled for this Saturday, and the household is in a flurry of preparation. Yet beneath the excitement, I sense currents of tension and old resentments that make me most uneasy. Lady Eleanor has graciously extended an invitation to you at my suggestion, and Lord Richard seemed particularly interested when I mentioned your surprising knowledge of poisonous plants. I hope you don't mind my mentioning that little incident with the digitalis at the vicarage garden party last summer. The enclosed invitation is official, but I implore you as a friend to come. The train to Thornfield Halt is most convenient, and the Blackwoods will send their chauffeur to collect you. Pack for at least a week's stay. The gardens alone are worth extended exploration, though I fear there may be more sinister blooms flourishing beneath the surface of this household. Your devoted friend, Dolly." I turned the letter over thoughtfully, then examined the enclosed invitation. It was engraved on cardstock, even finer than the stationery, with elaborate scrollwork surrounding the text. "Lord and Lady Blackwood request the pleasure of your company at Thornfield Hall for a garden reception celebrating the engagement of their daughter, Miss Sophia Blackwood, to Mr. Harold Pemberton, Saturday, the 25th of May, at 4 o'clock RSVP. Formal attire requested." "Will you be going, miss?" Cherry asked, making a poor pretense of dusting the mantelpiece while clearly waiting to hear my decision. "I believe I shall," I replied, setting the invitation on the small table beside me. "Would you be so kind as to bring down my larger suitcase from the attic? And I shall need to check the train timetable. It seems I may be away for a week or more." Cherry's eyes widened with interest. "A whole week at a grand house. Is it a party, miss?" "An engagement celebration," I said, though Mrs. Bantry hints at some disquiet among the household. The Blackwoods are an old family, I believe. The current Lord Blackwood is widely regarded as something of a botanical expert. Flowers and such?" Cherry looked underwhelmed. "Indeed, though from what Dolly suggests, his collection may include specimens of a more dangerous nature." I smiled at her curious expression. "Poisonous plants have a long and fascinating history, Cherry. Beauty and danger so often go hand in hand, particularly in the natural world. Like those lovely foxgloves in your garden that you warned me never to touch without gloves. Precisely so. Digitalis, a powerful cardiac medicine when properly administered, but potentially fatal in improper doses." I rose from my chair, my mind already turning to what I should pack for such a visit. "Thornfield is in Lancashire, I believe. The weather may be quite changeable." As I sorted through my wardrobe later that afternoon, I found myself reflecting on Dolly's letter. Her mention of currents of tension and old resentments was intriguing, as was her reference to Professor Montgomery. If memory served, Lionel Montgomery had published a rather controversial book the previous year on botanical poisons and their potential use in several unsolved deaths among the aristocracy. The scientific community had dismissed many of his theories as sensationalism, but the book had caused quite a stir in certain circles. The rain continued to drum against my bedroom window as thunder rumbled in the distance. Such dramatic weather seemed fitting given the somewhat ominous tone of Dolly's invitation. I carefully folded my best grey silk dress for the engagement party, along with several more practical ensembles for daytime wear. Almost as an afterthought, I retrieved my small, leather-bound notebook from my desk drawer, the one in which I had meticulously recorded various plants and their toxic properties over the years, a hobby stemming from my interest in natural remedy. Little did I know then how valuable that modest notebook would prove in the days to come, or how soon the peaceful gardens of Thornfield Hall would become the setting for a most terrible crime. The journey to Thornfield the following day was long but not unpleasant. The rain had cleared, giving way to that particular quality of English spring sunshine that transforms even the most ordinary landscape into something approaching the sublime. As the train moved northward, I watched the countryside change from the gentle, domesticated fields of the home counties to the more dramatic, untamed scenery of Lancashire. At Thornfield Halt, a small rural station that appeared to serve no purpose beyond the neighbouring estate, I was met by a tall, uniformed chauffeur who touched his cap respectfully. "Miss Marple, I'm Simmons, Lord Blackwood's driver. Let me take your luggage, ma'am. The car is just outside." The car proved to be a magnificent Rolls-Royce, gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. As we drove through the countryside, Simmons provided a running commentary on the local landmarks, though he grew notably more reserved when I inquired about his employers. "The Blackwoods have held Thornfield for over 300 years, ma'am," he said, his eyes fixed firmly on the winding road ahead. "His lordship is greatly respected in these parts." "And Lady Blackwood, I understand she's a cousin of Sir Arthur Bantry's family." "A distant connection, yes," Simmons replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Her ladyship came from the Sussex Harringtons originally, not quite as established as the Blackwoods, but a fine family nonetheless." I noted the slight hesitation with interest. "And I believe there's to be a celebration for Miss Blackwood's engagement." "Yes, ma'am, to Mr. Harold Pemberton, a manufacturing family from Manchester." This last detail was delivered with just the faintest emphasis that spoke volumes about the chauffeur's, and perhaps his employer's, view of new industrial money. "How delightful," I murmured, gazing out at the increasingly wild landscape. "Young love is always something to celebrate." Simmons made a noncommittal sound that might have been agreement, then fell silent as we turned onto a long, winding drive flanked by ancient oak trees. After several minutes, the trees gave way to immaculately maintained gardens, and beyond them, Thornfield Hall itself came into view. It was a magnificent structure, a perfect example of Elizabethan architecture with later Georgian additions, its warm stone glowing golden in the afternoon light. Extensive formal gardens surrounded the house, giving way to more naturalistic landscaping that blended seamlessly with the wild moors beyond. As the car crunched to a halt on the gravel sweep before the entrance, the massive oak door opened, and a striking woman in her early 50s emerged, followed by Dolly Bantry, who waved enthusiastically at the sight of me. "Jane, you've arrived at last." Dolly hurried down the steps, her round, good-natured face alight with pleasure as Simmons helped me from the car. "I'm so glad you could come. Lady Alina, may I present my dear friend, Miss Jane Marple." Lady Alina Blackwood extended a slim, bare-ringed hand. She was tall and elegantly proportioned, her silver-streaked dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that framed a face of austere beauty. Her eyes, a startling shade of amber, assessed me with cool interest. "Miss Marple, how delightful to meet you at last. Dolly has spoken so highly of your observational skills." There was the faintest emphasis on these last words that made me wonder exactly what Dolly had told her about my occasional involvement in unraveling mysteries. "Welcome to Thornfield. You're most kind to include me in your celebrations, Lady Blackwood," I replied, taking in the subtle details of her appearance. The exquisite quality of her pearl-grey afternoon dress, the flawless ruby and diamond rings, the overall impression of wealth worn with the ease that comes only from generations of privilege. Not at all. Any friend of Dolly's is welcome here, and I understand you share my husband's interest in botanical specimens. He'll be most eager to show you his collection. But you must be tired after your journey. Carson will show you to your room, and tea will be served in the south drawing-room in an hour. Dolly knows the way. With that, she nodded graciously and returned inside, leaving Dolly to link her arm through mine as we followed the dignified butler Carson into the grand entrance hall. "Oh, Jane, I'm so relieved you've come," Dolly whispered as we mounted the magnificent oak staircase. "The most dreadful atmosphere has developed since that professor arrived. Richard, Lord Blackwood, spends hours closeted with him in the greenhouses, and Lady Alina has taken to having headaches and retiring to her room. And the engaged couple. I've never seen two people less delighted to be marrying each other. Something is very wrong here. Perhaps it's merely the stress of planning a large social event," I suggested mildly, though I had already noted the tension in Lady Alina's posture and the strain behind her practiced social smile. "It's more than that," Dolly insisted as we reached the first-floor landing. "There's something poisonous in the air, and I don't mean the plants." Carson, walking ahead with my suitcase, cleared his throat meaningfully, and Dolly fell silent. We proceeded down a long corridor lined with ancestral portraits, stern-faced men and women in the fashions of previous centuries, all with the same proud bearing as the current Lady of Thornfield. "Your room, Miss Marple," Carson announced, opening a door near the end of the corridor. "Lady Blackwood thought you might appreciate the view of the gardens." The room was elegant without being ostentatious, furnished with genuine antiques that had clearly been in the family for generations. A large bay window overlooked the formal gardens, and beyond them I could see several glittering glass structures that must be the famous greenhouses. "This is lovely," I said appreciatively. "Please convey my thanks to Lady Blackwood." "Very good, miss. Your luggage will be unpacked, and hot water for washing has been provided. Tea is at 4 in the south drawing-room." With a slight bow, Carson departed, leaving Dolly and me alone. The moment the door closed, Dolly collapsed into an armchair. "Now we can talk freely. You won't believe what's been happening, Jane. 2 nights ago, I overheard the most extraordinary argument between Professor Montgomery and Lord Blackwood in the library. Something about irrefutable evidence and moral obligation. And when I mentioned it casually at breakfast the next morning, Lady Alina nearly fainted into her kedgeree. I was about to inquire further when there was a soft knock at the door, followed by the entrance of a young maid carrying hot water. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," she said with a quick curtsy. "I'm Lily, assigned to attend to you during your stay. Shall I unpack for you now?" "Thank you, Lily, that would be most helpful," I replied, noting her neat appearance and clear northern accent. As the girl efficiently unpacked my modest wardrobe, I turned back to the window, studying the elaborate gardens below. In the nearest greenhouse, I could see 2 figures moving among the plants, one tall and stooping, the other more robust. Even from this distance, there was something tense in their postures, their gestures animated as if in disagreement. "Is that Lord Blackwood in the greenhouse?" I asked quietly. Dolly joined me at the window. "Yes, with Professor Montgomery. They spend hours in there. And look, there's Sophia with her fiancé by the rose garden. See how far apart they're walking, most unnatural for an engaged couple." Indeed, the young woman and man strolling along the gravel path maintained a careful distance from each other, their body language suggesting constraint rather than affection. "Tell me about Miss Blackwood and Mr. Pemberton," I suggested, turning away from the window as Lily finished her unpacking and quietly left the room. "Sophia is the only child, about 25, I should think. Educated at Girton College in Cambridge, quite unusual for a girl of her background. Studied botany, following in her father's footsteps. As for Harold Pemberton, he's handsome enough in that solid, northern way, but entirely without Lord Blackwood's refinement. Old textile money from Manchester, thoroughly respectable but not precisely aristocratic. The engagement was announced rather suddenly 3 months ago. An arranged marriage? I asked, raising an eyebrow. One might think so, given their behavior, but no, Lady Alina was quite put out about it initially. Apparently, she had higher hopes for her only daughter than a Manchester manufacturer, however wealthy. But Lord Blackwood was unexpectedly supportive. Said something about new blood being good for old families. Dolly leaned closer, lowering her voice. Between us, I think there might be financial considerations. The estate is enormous, and keeping up those specialized greenhouses must cost a fortune. I nodded thoughtfully, sorting through this information. And Professor Montgomery? What brings him to Thornfield at such a family-centered time? Ostensibly to study Lord Blackwood's rare plant specimens for a new book. But there's more to it than that, I'm certain. He arrived with a letter of introduction from some scientific society, but he seems more interested in the family than the flowers, if you ask me. Watches everyone at dinner with those sharp eyes of his, asking the most probing questions disguised as casual conversation. How fascinating, I murmured, mentally cataloguing these details. I look forward to meeting everyone at tea. Dolly glanced at the delicate porcelain clock on the mantelpiece. We should go down soon. Oh, I nearly forgot to mention, Dr. Hartley will likely be there as well. He's the local physician, but practically part of the household. Attends to Lord Blackwood's occasional spells. Some sort of heart condition, I gather. Very attentive to Lady Alina as well. I see, I said, smoothing my dress and checking my appearance in the ornate mirror. Shall we go down, then? I find I'm quite looking forward to seeing these famous gardens up close. Little did I know that within 48 hours, those same beautiful gardens would become the scene of a most shocking death, and that the deadly blooms cultivated with such care by Lord Blackwood would provide not only the murder weapon, but also the key to unravelling a twisted tale of jealousy, ambition, and long-buried secret. Chapter 2. Currents beneath still waters. The south drawing-room of Thornfield Hall presented a perfect tableau of aristocratic English life when Dolly and I entered precisely at 4 o'clock. Sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the rose garden, illuminating a scene that might have been arranged for a society photographer's lens. Lady Alina presiding over a magnificent silver tea service. Lord Richard Blackwood standing by the fireplace in animated conversation with a thin, scholarly-looking gentleman whom I presumed to be Professor Montgomery, and a younger couple seated at a discreet distance from each other on a damask-covered settee. Ah, Miss Marple. Lord Blackwood broke away from his conversation and strode toward me, hand extended in welcome. He was a robust man in his early 60s, with the ruddy complexion of one who spends much time outdoors. Silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and penetrating blue eyes regarded me with genuine interest. What a pleasure to meet you at last. Dolly tells me you're something of a botanical enthusiast yourself. Merely an amateur gardener with a modest collection, Lord Blackwood, I replied, taking his offered hand. Nothing to compare with what I've glimpsed of your magnificent greenhouses. Richard, please, he insisted with the easy confidence of the truly well-born. We must arrange a tour tomorrow. I have several rare specimens in bloom that might interest you, including a rather magnificent Atropa belladonna with the most unusual purple variation. Deadly nightshade, I remarked. A fascinating plant, both for its medicinal properties and its dangers. His eyes lit up with appreciation. Precisely so. The line between remedy and poison is often merely a matter of dosage. Wouldn't you agree, Professor? The thin gentleman approached, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Indeed, though I might suggest that intention plays an equal role. The same compound that heals in a physician's hands may kill in another's. He extended a bony hand toward me. Professor Lionel Montgomery, Miss Marple, I understand you share our host's interest in botanical toxicology. Before I could respond, Lady Alina's voice cut across the room, her tone pleasant, but with an underlying edge. Tea is served, gentlemen. Do let Miss Marple settle in before subjecting her to botanical lectures." As we moved toward the tea table, Lord Blackwood performed the remaining introduction. "My daughter, Sophia," he said, indicating the young woman who had risen from the settee. Sophia Blackwood was tall like her mother, but where Lady Alina was all cool elegance, Sophia possessed a more vibrant, if currently subdued, energy. Her dark hair was styled simply, and her green eyes held intelligence and something I could only describe as wariness. She greeted me politely, but without warmth. "Her fiancé, Harold Pemberton," Lord Blackwood continued, gesturing toward the young man who had also risen. Mr. Pemberton was handsome in a conventional way, broad-shouldered, with the physique of a rugby player rather than a scholar, his fair hair and ruddy complexion contrasting with the Blackwood's darker colouring. He bowed slightly. "A pleasure, Miss Marple." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Pemberton," I replied, noting the tension in his posture and the careful way he avoided looking at his fiancée. "May I offer my congratulations on your engagement?" "Thank you," he said stiffly. "Most kind." As we arranged ourselves around the tea table, I observed the subtle dynamics at play. Lady Alina served tea with practiced grace, but her eyes frequently darted between her husband and Professor Montgomery with barely concealed anxiety. Lord Blackwood, by contrast, seemed almost oblivious to the underlying tension, enthusiastically discussing a rare orchid he had recently acquired from Borneo. "Ah, Hartley, just in time for tea." Lord Blackwood's exclamation drew my attention to a newcomer entering the room, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 50, with prematurely grey hair and an air of quiet authority. "Miss Marple, allow me to introduce Dr. James Hartley, our good friend and physician." "You do, Miss Marple." Dr. Hartley's handshake was firm, his assessment professional yet courteous. "I trust your journey wasn't too fatiguing." "Not at all, Doctor. The countryside is particularly beautiful at this time of year." "Indeed." He accepted a cup of tea from Lady Alina with a smile that struck me as perhaps a shade too familiar for physician and patient. "The gardens are at their best as well, though I understand you're accustomed to impressive horticulture in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry tells me your cottage garden is quite renowned locally." "You flatter me, Doctor. My humble efforts could never compete with Lord Blackwood's collection." "Few collections could," Professor Montgomery interjected, his thin lips curving into what might have been a smile. "Richard has specimens that major botanical gardens would envy, particularly his Apocynaceae family, most impressive." "The Dogbane family," I remarked, "including oleander and periwinkle, if I'm not mistaken." "Many with significant cardiac glycosides." Professor Montgomery's eyebrows rose slightly. "You are remarkably well informed for an amateur, Miss Marple." "Jane has a particular interest in poisonous plants," Dolly said cheerfully, reaching for a cucumber sandwich. "Purely academic, of course." "Of course," echoed Professor Montgomery, studying me with new interest. "Though such knowledge can be applied in various ways." "Surely academic interest in toxic plants is common enough among gardeners," Lady Alina said sharply. "Richard has been collecting them for years without incident." "Without known incident," the professor corrected softly, causing Lady Alina's hand to tremble slightly as she set down her teacup. An uncomfortable silence descended, broken only when Sophia suddenly spoke. "Father, have you shown Professor Montgomery the new aconitum hybrids yet? The purple-white variation is particularly striking." "Monkshood," I murmured appreciatively. "Such elegant flowers, despite their deadly nature." "Beauty and danger often coexist, particularly in the natural world," Lord Blackwood said, echoing almost exactly the sentiment I had expressed to Cherry Baker before my departure. "The gardens are full of such dichotomies." "As is this household, I fear," Professor Montgomery said quietly, his gaze moving deliberately from Lord Blackwood to his wife, and then, most curiously, to Dr. Hartley, who stiffened visibly. "I'm sure Miss Marple has no interest in your cryptic observations, Professor," Dr. Hartley said firmly. "She's here to enjoy the gardens and celebrate Sophia's engagement." "Indeed," Lady Alina agreed quickly. Speaking of which, Sophia, we must finalize the music selections for Saturday's party. The string quartet has requested our preferences by tomorrow. The conversation turned to safer topics: the upcoming celebration, local landmarks that might interest visitors, the unusual weather patterns this spring. Yet beneath the polite discourse, I sensed currents of anxiety, resentment, and something that felt remarkably like fear. As tea concluded, Lord Blackwood suggested a brief tour of the nearest gardens before dinner. Nothing too taxing, he assured me. Just the formal rose garden, and perhaps a glimpse of the Mediterranean greenhouse. The more extensive tour can wait until tomorrow when you're properly rested. That sounds delightful, I replied, genuinely eager to see the famous Thornfield Gardens up close. Our small party proceeded outside, where the late afternoon sunlight cast a golden glow over the meticulously maintained landscapes. Lady Alina excused herself, mentioning correspondence that required her attention, while Dr. Hartley was called away to attend a patient in the village. This left Lord Blackwood, Professor Montgomery, Dolly, Sophia, Mr. Pemberton, and myself to wander the garden paths. The formal rose garden was indeed spectacular. Hundreds of varieties arranged in geometric patterns, their fragrance heavy in the warm air. Beyond lay herbaceous borders bursting with early summer blooms, and further still, the first of several enormous glasshouses gleaming in the sunlight. The Mediterranean house, Lord Blackwood announced proudly as we approached. Home to my citrus collection and various heat-loving specimens that wouldn't survive our English winters. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with the scent of orange blossoms. Mature citrus trees in massive terracotta pots lined a central walkway, while more exotic plants occupied the side benches. Magnificent, I said sincerely, admiring the perfect symmetry of the displays. Your gardeners must be exceptionally skilled. Jenkins is the best head gardener in the county, Lord Blackwood agreed. Been with the family for 40 years. Knows these plants as well as I do, better, in some cases. And these? I inquired, indicating a collection of plants with distinctive white flowers clustered at the far end of the greenhouse. Ah, Datura, Angel's trumpet, Professor Montgomery answered before Lord Blackwood could speak. A fascinating genus. All parts contain tropin alkaloids, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, atropine, powerful hallucinogens, and in sufficient quantity, lethal poisons. Yet also valuable medicines when properly prepared, Lord Blackwood added quickly. The pharmaceutical applications of many so-called poisonous plants are quite remarkable. Indeed, the professor agreed, though his tone suggested some reservation. The duality fascinates me. The same plant that can induce fatal respiratory paralysis might also, in different hands, relieve the symptoms of asthma. It all depends on who is administering the dose, and why. I noticed Sophia and Harold exchange a quick, unreadable glance at these words. You speak as if you suspect someone of misusing botanical knowledge, Professor, Sophia said, her voice carefully controlled. I speak as a scientist, Miss Blackwood, Montgomery replied smoothly. Observing, hypothesizing, gathering evidence. It's merely my nature to question. And what exactly are you questioning during your stay with us? Harold Pemberton asked bluntly, speaking up for the first time since we had left the house. Harold, Sophia murmured in warning, placing a restraining hand on his arm. No, it's a fair inquiry, Montgomery said, appearing unperturbed. Lord Blackwood has kindly granted me access to his collection for my new monograph on botanical toxicology. My particular interest is in plants that leave minimal traces in post-mortem examinations. A matter of academic significance, I assure you. Yet your previous book suggested several aristocratic deaths might have been undetected poisonings, Mr. Pemberton persisted. Hardly a topic likely to endear you to your hosts. An uncomfortable silence followed this observation. Lord Blackwood cleared his throat. Science must be pursued wherever it leads, my boy, even into uncomfortable territories. The professor's theories, while controversial, are not without merit. Richard, Dolly exclaimed, clearly shocked by this admission. Surely you don't believe members of your own class have been murdering each other with exotic plant toxins, Professor Montgomery supplied helpfully. It would hardly be unprecedented historically. The Borgias elevated botanical homicide to an art form, and they were among the highest nobility of their day. This conversation has taken a most distasteful turn, Sophia declared, her face pale. Father, I believe it's time to return to the house. Dinner is at 8, and our guests will want to freshen up. Of course, my dear, Lord Blackwood agreed, though I detected reluctance in his tone. We can continue our horticultural discussions tomorrow, Miss Marple. I have much more to show you. As we made our way back to the house, I found myself walking alongside Sophia, who had fallen behind the others. My father's botanical obsessions can be rather overwhelming, she said quietly. I hope you weren't too bored by all the technical discussion. Not at all, I assured her. I find the subject quite fascinating. I understand you studied botany yourself at university. A shadow seemed to cross her face. Yes, though my interests lie more in conservation than in collecting curiosities. Father's focus on toxic specimens has always struck me as somewhat morbid. Yet you mentioned the aconitum hybrids at tea, I observed mildly. You must take some interest in his work. One absorbs the family preoccupations, she replied with a tight smile, whether one wishes to or not. And Mr. Pemberton, does he share your botanical interests? Harold's concerns are more practical, his textile factories, his investments. He tolerates my father's enthusiasm but doesn't share it. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, Miss Marple, I hope you won't think badly of us. This engagement celebration has created tension. Professor Montgomery's presence hasn't helped matters. His insinuations about poisonings and his constant probing questions have everyone on edge. I would never presume to judge, my dear, I said gently. Family dynamics are complex at the best of times, let alone during significant life changes. She gave me a grateful look, but said no more as we rejoined the others at the terrace step. Dinner that evening was a formal affair in the magnificent dining room, where ancestral portraits gazed down upon us from gilded frames, and footmen in livery served course after exquisite course. The conversation remained deliberately light, with no return to the uncomfortable topics raised in the greenhouse. Yet I could not help but observe the subtle undercurrents. Lady Alina's tight-lipped responses whenever Professor Montgomery spoke directly to her. The way Dr. Hartley, who had returned for dinner, watched the interaction between Lady Alina and her husband with barely concealed concern. The careful distance maintained between Sophia and her fiancé, despite their adjacent seating. Later, as I prepared for bed in my comfortable room, I reflected on these observations. Something was indeed amiss at Thornfield Hall, though whether it related to the upcoming marriage, Professor Montgomery's research, or some entirely different matter remained unclear. I was just about to turn out my bedside lamp when a soft knock sounded at my door. Opening it, I found Sophia Blackwood standing in the corridor, her face pale in the dim light. Miss Marple, she whispered, might I speak with you privately? There's something you should know, something I fear may endanger us all. Chapter 3. Whispers in the night. I ushered Sophia quickly into my room, noting her evident distress. She wore a silk dressing gown over her nightdress, her dark hair hanging loose about her shoulders, and her hands, I couldn't help but observe, trembled slightly as she clasped and unclasped them before her. My dear, whatever is the matter? I asked, guiding her to a chair by the window while I took the one opposite. The curtains remained open, and moonlight spilled across the carpet between us, casting Sophia's troubled face in a silvery glow that accentuated her pallor. I shouldn't be here, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. If Mother knew. But I had to speak with someone, and Mrs. Bantry said that you had experience with. She broke off, seemingly unable to articulate precisely what Dolly might have told her about my occasional involvement in matters of a criminal nature. Take your time, my dear, I said gently. Whatever you tell me will be held in the strictest confidence, I assure you. She drew a deep breath, visibly collecting herself. It's about Professor Montgomery. His presence here isn't merely academic, Miss Marple. He's investigating my father." "Investigating," I repeated. "In what capacity? He's a botanist, not a policeman." "He believes." Sophia glanced toward the door as if fearing eavesdroppers, then continued in an even lower voice. "He believes that father may have been involved in the death of his former research partner, Dr. Edwin Palmer, 2 years ago. They had a bitter falling out over the attribution of certain botanical discoveries, and Dr. Palmer died suddenly before their dispute could be resolved publicly." "I see," I said carefully. "And the official cause of death?" "Heart failure," Sophia replied. Dr. Palmer had a known cardiac condition. The death was not considered suspicious at the time. "But Professor Montgomery thinks otherwise," she nodded. "He's been gathering evidence, he claims. Something about trace alkaloids that wouldn't have been detected in a routine post-mortem. He confronted father privately yesterday. I overheard them arguing in the library. Father denied everything, of course, but—" Her voice faltered. "You have doubts about your father's innocence," I suggested quietly. Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't want to, but father has changed these past few years. His obsession with toxic plants has intensified, becoming almost consuming. And his mood swings, periods of euphoria followed by dark depressions. Mother attributes it to age and eccentricity, but I've wondered if there might be something more sinister involved. Have you shared these concerns with anyone else? Your fiancé, perhaps?" A flash of something, apprehension, guilt, crossed her face. "Harold knows I'm worried about father's behavior, but not the specifics of Professor Montgomery's accusations. Our engagement has already created enough tension in the household without adding such suspicions to the mix." "Tension," I prompted. "I had noticed a certain reserve between you and Mr. Pemberton. Forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, but it seems unusual for a recently engaged couple." Sophia's laugh held no humor. "Reserved is a diplomatic way of putting it. The truth is, our engagement was never meant to be anything but a business arrangement." She rose abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens below. "Harold's family has money, new money from textiles, as I'm sure you've gathered, but lacks the social standing they crave. My family has an ancient name, but, as it happens, dwindling resources. The Thornfield estate costs a fortune to maintain, especially father's exotic plant collection." She turned back to face me, her expression bitter. "A perfect match, according to my parents. I was prepared to do my duty to save the family legacy, but now with these accusations against father." "You fear scandal might jeopardize the engagement," I suggested. "Among other things." She hesitated, then continued with evident reluctance. "There's more, Miss Marple. Something I've told no one, not even Harold. I believe someone may be slowly poisoning my father." I sat perfectly still, absorbing this startling declaration. "That is a very serious allegation, my dear. What evidence leads you to such a conclusion?" "His symptoms," Sophia replied, returning to her chair and leaning forward earnestly. "The mood swings I mentioned, periods of confusion followed by unusual clarity, occasional tremors in his hands, digestive disturbances. Dr. Hartley attributes it all to age and overwork, but I've studied botanical toxicology. These symptoms are consistent with low-level exposure to certain plant-derived poisons. Have you considered that your father, given his expertise, might be experimenting on himself?" I suggested. "I understand some botanical researchers have engaged in such practices historically." She shook her head firmly. "Father is meticulous about safety protocols in his work. Would never risk accidental exposure, let alone deliberate self-experimentation." "Then who do you suspect might wish to harm him?" Sophia's gaze dropped to her clasped hands. "That's the most terrible part, Miss Marple. The only people with sufficient knowledge of toxic plants and regular access to father's food and drink are my mother, Dr. Hartley, and myself." "Surely you don't suspect yourself, my dear," I said gently. "Of course not. But I can't bear to think that mother—" Broke off, unable to complete the thought. "And Dr. Hartley, what motive might he have?" A flush spread across her pale cheeks. "Dr. Hartley has been devoted to my mother for years. Their attachment predates my own memory. Father is either oblivious or chooses to ignore it. I see, I said, though in truth, the picture was becoming increasingly complex. And Professor Montgomery, does he share your suspicions about your father being poisoned? That's what frightens me most, Sophia whispered. I believe he came here ostensibly to investigate Father for Dr. Palmer's death, but has instead uncovered evidence that Father himself is being poisoned. He's been taking samples, soil from the gardens, leaves from certain plants, even, I suspect, items from Father's private rooms. I fear what might happen if he announces his findings publicly. Has he threatened to do so? Not explicitly. But at dinner tonight, did you notice how he asked Father to recommend a particular tea blend for calming the nerves? Father suggested his personal chamomile mixture, and the professor remarked that he'd be most interested in analyzing its precise composition. It was a veiled warning, I'm certain of it. I considered her words carefully. What exactly is it you wish me to do, Miss Sophia? Help me discover the truth before Saturday's garden party, she pleaded. If Father is being poisoned, I must know by whom and why. And if Professor Montgomery intends to make accusations against Father for Dr. Palmer's death, or against one of us for attempting to poison Father, I need to be prepared. The clock on my bedside table chimed midnight, making us both start slightly at the sudden sound. I should go, Sophia said, rising quickly. Mother sometimes checks my room when she cannot sleep. One moment, I said, detaining her with a gentle hand on her arm. Does Professor Montgomery know about your engagement circumstances, the financial arrangements behind it? She frowned. I don't believe so. Why? It may be relevant or it may not. In matters like this, every detail can be significant. Rest assured, I will observe carefully in the coming days. At the door, Sophia paused. Thank you, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry said you would understand, that you've encountered similar situations in your village. St. Mary Mead may be small, my dear, but human nature is much the same everywhere. Jealousy, greed, fear, love, these motivate people in grand houses and humble cottages alike. After she had gone, I sat for a long while by the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens of Thornfield. Something about Sophia's story troubled me, though I couldn't yet pinpoint the inconsistency that nagged at my intuition. Eventually, I drew the curtains and retired to bed, knowing that the morning would bring fresh observations, and perhaps further revelations. Breakfast at Thornfield was served in a sun-filled morning room overlooking the eastern gardens. I arrived to find most of the household already assembled around a magnificent buffet of silver chafing dishes containing everything from kedgeree to deviled kidneys, with a side table dedicated to fruits, pastries, and various breads. Ah, Miss Marple. Lord Blackwood greeted me jovially from the head of the table. I trust you slept well. I thought we might tour the tropical greenhouse this morning if you're amenable. Several of my rarest orchids are in bloom. I studied him carefully as I took my seat, looking for signs of the symptoms Sophia had described. There was perhaps a slight tremor in his hand as he lifted his coffee cup, but nothing that wouldn't be expected in a man of his years. His colour was good, his eyes clear and alert. I should enjoy that very much, Lord Blackwood, I replied, accepting a cup of tea from a hovering footman. Lady Alina, elegant as ever in a morning dress of pale blue silk, arched an eyebrow. Richard, you mustn't monopolize Miss Marple with botanical lectures. I'm sure she would appreciate seeing the village and surrounding countryside as well. Perhaps this afternoon, Lord Blackwood conceded. Pemberton has expressed interest in the local architecture. Perhaps you might accompany them, Alina. Lady Alina's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. I had planned to review the final arrangements for Saturday's party with Mrs. Wilson today. I am perfectly happy to divide my time between botanical and architectural interests, I interjected smoothly. The flora and the built environment often reflect each other in fascinating ways. Professor Montgomery, who had been silently observing this exchange while methodically dissecting a kipper, looked up with a thin smile. How diplomatically expressed, Miss Marple. Indeed, both disciplines require careful attention to structure and composition. Though I find botanical specimens generally more honest than human constructions, Plants cannot disguise their true nature, while buildings, like people, often present false fronts. An uncomfortable silence followed this observation, broken only when Dr. Hartley entered the room with a cheerful, "Good morning, all. Splendid day for garden explorations, wouldn't you say?" I noticed how his gaze went immediately to Lady Elena, who acknowledged him with a slight nod before returning her attention to her barely touched plate. Sophia and Harold Pemberton had not yet appeared, nor had Dolly, who had warned me the previous evening that she was not a breakfast person, and rarely emerged before 10. After breakfast, true to his word, Lord Blackwood escorted me to the largest of the glass houses, a magnificent Victorian structure of iron and glass that dominated the eastern edge of the formal gardens. Inside, the humid air was heavy with the scent of exotic blooms and rich, peaty soil. Tropical plants of every description filled the space, arranged by geographic origin and botanical family. "My orchid collection," Lord Blackwood announced proudly, leading me to a special section where dozens of bizarre and beautiful specimens were displayed. Many are quite rare, several possibly unique to Thornfield. "They're extraordinary," I said sincerely, admiring a particularly striking bloom with mottled purple petals. "That specimen is unusually colored for a cattleya, isn't it?" His eyebrows rose in pleased surprise. "You have a good eye, Miss Marple." "Yes, it's a hybrid of my own creation, a cross between Cattleya dowiana and a rare Vanda species from Borneo. I've named it Elena's Star, after my wife." "How romantic," I murmured, noting the flash of genuine warmth in his expression as he mentioned Lady Elena. Whatever tensions existed in their marriage, there appeared to be real affection on his part, at least. "Richard has always been the sentimental type," came Professor Montgomery's voice from behind us. He had entered the greenhouse so quietly that both Lord Blackwood and I started slightly at his sudden appearance. His attachment to both plants and people runs deep, sometimes to his detriment. "I wasn't aware that loyalty and affection were detrimental qualities, Professor," I remarked mildly. "They are when they blind one to unpleasant realities," Montgomery replied, moving closer to examine the orchid. "A beautiful specimen, Richard. The coloration reminds me somewhat of certain aconitum varieties, does it not? That same deadly purple." Lord Blackwood's expression hardened. "If you've come to continue last night's discussion, Lionel, I suggest we do so privately." "On the contrary, I thought Miss Marple might offer a fresh perspective on our botanical debate. Given her interest in toxic plants, she might appreciate the ethical considerations of our research." "I fear I'm not qualified to contribute to scientific debates at your level," I demurred. "Nonsense," Professor Montgomery insisted. "Richard tells me you recognized the deadly nightshade in the Mediterranean house immediately yesterday, and you correctly identified the belladonna alkaloids in our tea conversation. I suspect your knowledge is more extensive than you claim." "A lifetime of gardening teaches one to recognize dangerous plants," I said. "Purely as a safety measure, you understand." "Of course," he agreed, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "Though I imagine such knowledge, in the wrong hands, could be quite dangerous. Wouldn't you agree, Richard?" Lord Blackwood's face flushed with evident anger. "I believe Miss Marple and I were in the middle of a tour, Lionel. If you'll excuse us." "Actually," I interjected, "I noticed your head gardener working in the herb garden as we passed. If you gentlemen have matters to discuss, I will be most interested in speaking with him about his techniques. My own herb bed at home is rather disappointing this year." Lord Blackwood hesitated, clearly torn between courtesy to his guest and whatever private matter needed addressing with Professor Montgomery. "If you're certain you don't mind, Miss Marple, Jenkins is indeed a fountain of knowledge. I'll send someone to fetch you when we've concluded our discussion." "That would be perfect," I assured him, already moving toward the greenhouse exit. "Please, take all the time you need." As I departed, I heard Professor Montgomery's voice, pitched low but still audible. "She knows more than she's letting on, Richard. Are you certain Dolly Bantry hasn't shared her suspicions with her friend?" I didn't linger to hear Lord Blackwood's response, instead making my way purposefully toward the herb garden, where the elderly head gardener was methodically harvesting what appeared to be sage and thyme. My mind was working rapidly, attempting to organize the various pieces of this increasingly complex puzzle. Sophia's nocturnal visit had added new dimensions to consider, and Professor Montgomery's behavior suggested agendas within agendas. Jenkins proved to be a treasure trove of both horticultural wisdom and household information. As we discussed the proper pruning of rosemary, a subject on which he had strong opinions, I gradually steered the conversation toward the Blackwood family. "You've been with the family for many years, I understand," I inquired, helping him to bundle the freshly cut herbs. "Man and boy, miss," he confirmed proudly. "Started as an apprentice under my father when the old lord, the current one's father, was still alive. Seen a lot of changes, I have. Lord Blackwood's plant collection seems to be a relatively recent development, though," I suggested. Jenkins nodded. "The serious collecting started about 15 years ago, after his lordship's brother passed. Left him a tidy inheritance, did Mr. Alfred, with the stipulation it be used for botanical pursuits. Most particular, Mr. Alfred was about plants, had his own rare specimen collection in London, though nothing like what his lordship has built here." "How fascinating," I murmured. "And Lady Blackwood, has she always shared her husband's enthusiasm?" A guarded expression crossed the gardener's weathered face. "Not my place to comment on her ladyship's interests, miss." "Of course," I agreed quickly. "I merely wondered if she had any particular favourites among the gardens." Mrs. Bantry mentioned that Lady Blackwood prefers the rose garden to the greenhouses. Jenkins relaxed slightly. "That's right enough. Her ladyship likes her flowers ornamental and sweet-smelling, not one for the unusual specimens his lordship favours. Miss Sophia takes after her father, though, or did when she was younger, always following him about the gardens, learning the Latin names and such. But not recently. Been away at her studies, hasn't she? Cambridge, if you please. Very modern. And now with the engagement. Mr. Pemberton doesn't share the family's botanical interests." Jenkins made a sound that wasn't quite a snort. "Manchester factory owner's son. Wouldn't know a rare orchid from a common daisy, begging your pardon. More interested in how much the greenhouses cost to heat than what grows inside them, if you take my meaning." "I see," I said thoughtfully. "And Professor Montgomery's visit, is that a regular occurrence?" The old man's hands stilled momentarily. "First time he's been to Thornfield, as far as I know. His lordship mentioned they corresponded about botanical matters, but they've not been close, like his lordship was with Dr. Palmer." "Dr. Palmer," I prompted innocently. "His lordship's research partner before. Well, before he passed 2 years back. Terrible shame. They were working on a book together, all about medicinal applications of rare plants. Very revolutionary, his lordship said. I understand Dr. Palmer died suddenly." Jenkins nodded solemnly. "Heart gave out, so they say, working too hard, according to Dr. Hartley, always in those greenhouses at all hours, much like his lordship. Dr. Hartley was acquainted with Dr. Palmer then." "Oh, yes. Dr. Hartley's been the family physician for years, attended all of them at one time or another, practically part of the household." Before I could inquire further, a young gardener's apprentice approached. "Begging your pardon, miss. His lordship sent me to fetch you. He's waiting in the tropical house." I thanked Jenkins for his insights and followed the young man back through the gardens. As we walked, I noticed Sophia and Harold Pemberton engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion near the rose garden. Their postures were tense, and though I couldn't hear their words, the intensity of their exchange was evident. Returning to the tropical greenhouse, I found Lord Blackwood alone, Professor Montgomery having apparently departed. His lordship's expression was troubled, but he made a visible effort to assume a more cheerful demeanour as I approached. "Ah, Miss Marple, I hope Jenkins didn't bore you with technical details about compost heaps and pruning schedules." "Not at all," I assured him. "I found his knowledge quite illuminating. He mentioned your previous collaboration with Dr. Palmer. It sounds as though you were working on something quite significant together." A shadow crossed his face. "Edwin was a brilliant botanist. Ahead of his time in many ways. His death was a tremendous loss to the field. We had discovered several novel compounds with potential pharmaceutical applications. How tragic that he didn't live to see your work completed. Yes, Lord Blackwood agreed, his gaze distant. Though I've continued our research alone. Some of our findings will be published next year in the Journal of Botanical Medicine. I'm sure he would be pleased to know his work lives on, I said gently. Lord Blackwood's eyes refocused on me with unexpected sharpness. You're very perceptive, Miss Marple. Dolly suggested you might be. I wonder, has Sophia spoken with you yet? The directness of the question caught me somewhat off guard. Spoken with me? About what in particular? He studied me for a moment, then sighed. Never mind. If she hasn't confided in you, it's not my place to do so. Shall we continue our tour? The fern collection is particularly fine, if you're interested. As we moved deeper into the greenhouse, I couldn't help but feel that the mysteries of Thornfield Hall were multiplying rather than clarifying. Sophia feared her father was being poisoned, while Professor Montgomery seemed to suspect Lord Blackwood himself of some malfeasance related to Dr. Palmer's death. And somewhere beneath these suspicions lay the tensions of the approaching engagement celebration, with all its financial and social implications. Little did I know that within hours, one of these tangled threads would lead to a shocking death, transforming theoretical dangers into all too real tragedy among the deadly blooms of Thornfield's gardens. Chapter 4. Death in the Garden. The remainder of that morning passed pleasantly enough, as Lord Blackwood guided me through his extraordinary botanical collections. His enthusiasm was infectious, and despite the undercurrents of tension I had observed, I found myself genuinely impressed by both his knowledge and the scope of his achievements. By luncheon, we had explored 3 separate glasshouses, each devoted to different climate zones and plant families. You must be quite exhausted, Miss Marple, Lady Alina remarked as we assembled in the smaller dining room for the midday meal. Richard tends to forget that not everyone shares his botanical obsessions. On the contrary, I replied truthfully, I found it all utterly fascinating. Lord Blackwood's collection is remarkable. Indeed, Professor Montgomery agreed, his thin lips curving into something approximating a smile. Particularly the aconitum varieties. I don't believe I've seen such extensive hybridization outside of specialized research facilities. Lady Alina's hand tightened visibly around her water glass. Must we discuss Richard's poisonous plants at the table? I'm sure our guests have more pleasant topics of conversation. Actually, Dolly interjected, I've arranged for us to visit the village this afternoon. The medieval church has some quite lovely stained glass, and there's a rather charming tea room beside the green. Splendid idea, Dr. Hartley approved, having joined us for luncheon once again. Miss Marple deserves to see something beyond Richard's botanical menagerie. What about you, Professor? Harold Pemberton asked, speaking up for the first time. Will you be joining the village expedition, or are you too absorbed in your research? Something in his tone caused Sophia to shoot him a warning glance, which he either didn't notice or chose to ignore. My work here is nearing its conclusion, Montgomery replied evenly. I hope to complete my final observations this afternoon, in fact. By dinner, I should have all the answers I've been seeking. Statement hung in the air like a veiled threat. Lord Blackwood's knife and fork paused momentarily above his plate, while Lady Alina's face seemed to pale beneath her perfectly applied rouge. How convenient, Dr. Hartley remarked, his voice tight. Just in time for tomorrow's festivities. Yes, the professor agreed. I wouldn't want my academic interests to overshadow Miss Blackwood's celebration. Sophia pushed her barely touched plate away. If you'll excuse me, I have a headache coming on. I think I'll lie down before the village excursion. I'll walk you upstairs, Harold offered, rising quickly. No need, she replied coolly. Please, everyone, continue your lunch. As she departed, an uncomfortable silence descended upon the table, broken only when Lord Blackwood deliberately steered the conversation towards safer topics. The weather forecast for Saturday's garden party, the string quartet that had been engaged to play, the chef's plans for the celebratory dinner. Later, as our small party consisting of Dolly, Lady Alina, Harold Pemberton, Dr. Hartley, and myself. Prepared to depart for the village, I noticed Lord Blackwood and Professor Montgomery heading together toward the furthest greenhouse, their postures suggesting the continuation of some intense discussion. "They've been like that since Montgomery arrived," Dr. Hartley remarked, following my gaze. "Locked in scientific debate from dawn till dusk. One might think they were discussing matters of life and death rather than plant specimens. Perhaps to a botanist they are one and the same," I suggested mildly. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem remarkably understanding of Richard's peculiar interests, Miss Marple." "I find all passionate pursuits interesting, Doctor, whether I share them or not. Human enthusiasm is a fascinating study in itself, don't you agree?" Before he could respond, Lady Alina called us to the waiting automobiles, her own elegant Daimler, driven by Simmons, and Dr. Hartley's more modest Morris. I found myself in the Daimler with Lady Alina and Dolly, while Harold Pemberton accompanied Dr. Hartley in the second vehicle. The village of Thornfield proved to be as picturesque as Dolly had promised, with a Norman church, a quintessential village green, and a row of charming cottages that might have been plucked straight from a postcard. We dutifully admired the stained glass, visited the local tea room for refreshments, and browsed the small antique shop that constituted the village's primary commercial establishment. Throughout the excursion, I couldn't help but observe the dynamics between our party members. Lady Alina and Dr. Hartley maintained a careful distance from each other in public, though I caught several meaningful glances exchanged when they thought themselves unobserved. Harold Pemberton seemed distracted and ill at ease, checking his wristwatch repeatedly and contributing little to the conversation. It was nearly 5 o'clock when we returned to Thornfield Hall. As our automobiles crunched up the gravel drive, I noticed an unusual flurry of activity near the tropical greenhouse, several gardeners rushing about, and what appeared to be Lord Blackwood gesticulating urgently to Jenkins, the head gardener. "What on earth is happening?" Lady Alina murmured, leaning forward in her seat. Dr. Hartley, who had parked his Morris behind us, approached our vehicle as Simmons opened the door. "Something's wrong," he said tersely. "I'd better see if Richard needs medical assistance." He strode quickly toward the greenhouse, his medical bag, which he had fortuitously brought along for our village expedition, in hand. After a moment's hesitation, the rest of us followed at a more measured pace. As we neared the greenhouse, Carson, the butler, emerged from the house and intercepted Lady Alina. "My lady," he said in a low, urgent voice, "there has been an incident in the tropical house. His lordship asks that you keep the guests away for the moment." "What sort of incident, Carson?" Lady Alina demanded, her aristocratic composure momentarily slipping. "Is my husband injured?" "No, my lady, it's Professor Montgomery." A chill ran through me at his tone. "The professor is hurt?" I inquired gently. Carson's grave expression told us everything before he spoke. "Dr. Hartley believes the professor is dead, miss. Apparent collapse while examining some plant specimens. His lordship is quite distraught." Lady Alina's hand flew to her throat. "Dead? But that's impossible. He was perfectly well at luncheon." "Where is Sophia?" Harold demanded suddenly. "Has anyone seen her since she left the dining room?" "Miss Blackwood is in her room, sir," Carson replied. "Her maid confirms she has been resting all afternoon." "I should go to Richard," Lady Alina said, making as if to move toward the greenhouse. "His lordship specifically asked that everyone return to the house, my lady," Carson insisted. "He said the situation is delicate." "Delicate," Dolly echoed, her normally cheerful face creased with concern. "Whatever does he mean?" "I believe he fears the death may not have been from natural causes, madam," Carson said, lowering his voice further. "Dr. Hartley has suggested there may be suspicious circumstances." A heavy silence fell over our group as the implication of these words sank in. Harold Pemberton was the first to recover. "Are you saying Montgomery was murdered? That's preposterous. Who would want to kill a botanist?" "I couldn't say, sir," Carson replied stiffly. "I'm merely relaying his lordship's request that everyone return to the house while the matter is investigated." We had little choice but to comply. As we walked back toward the main entrance, I glanced over my shoulder at the tropical greenhouse. Through its glass walls, I could make out several figures. Lord Blackwood's distinctive silhouette, Dr. Hartley kneeling beside what must be the prone form of Professor Montgomery, and several gardeners hovering uncertainly in the background. In the drawing room, Lady Alina paced anxiously while Carson arranged for tea to be served. Dolly sat with me on a small sofa, her usually buoyant spirits subdued by the shocking turn of events. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "A death, a possibly suspicious death, at Thornfield, and on the eve of Sophia's engagement celebration. It's too terrible." "Indeed," I agreed, my mind working rapidly to process this new development. "Tell me, Dolly, did you notice anything unusual about the professor's behavior today? Any sign of illness or distress?" She considered the question. "Not illness, exactly. But he did seem intent, didn't he? Almost triumphant at luncheon when he mentioned completing his research, as if he'd discovered something significant." "Yes," I murmured. "I had that impression as well." Harold Pemberton, who had been standing by the window staring out at the gardens, turned abruptly. "I should check on Sophia. She ought to know what's happened." "Carson said she was resting," Lady Alina reminded him. "This is hardly the time to be concerned with social niceties," he retorted. "A man is dead in your greenhouse, Lady Blackwood. I think that warrants disturbing Sophia's rest." Before Lady Alina could respond, the drawing-room door opened to admit a grave-faced Dr. Hartley and a visibly shaken Lord Blackwood. "Alina," Lord Blackwood said, his voice unsteady, "we've had a most terrible accident. Lionel, Professor Montgomery, is dead." Lady Alina moved swiftly to her husband's side, propriety overcoming whatever tensions existed between them. "Richard, how dreadful! What happened?" "He appears to have collapsed while examining one of the aconitum specimens," Dr. Hartley explained, his professional demeanor firmly in place despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Given the rapid onset and nature of his symptoms, I suspect poisoning from aconitum toxin, monkshood, as it's commonly known." "But how?" Harold demanded. "Surely an experienced botanist wouldn't accidentally poison himself with a plant he was studying." Dr. Hartley's expression tightened. "That is the troubling aspect. The professor was wearing protective gloves, as is standard practice when handling toxic specimens. Yet the symptoms are consistent with aconitine poisoning, rapid onset of numbness, respiratory distress, and cardiac arrhythmia leading to heart failure." "Are you suggesting it wasn't an accident?" Lady Alina asked faintly. Lord Blackwood sank heavily into an armchair. "The circumstances are difficult to explain. Lionel was examining my newest aconitum hybrid when he suddenly clutched at his throat, gasped something unintelligible, and collapsed. I immediately called for help, but by the time Jenkins reached us with the emergency medical kit we keep in the gardens, Lionel was already beyond aid. I've notified the local police," Dr. Hartley added. "Given the unusual circumstances, an investigation will be necessary. I expect Inspector Craddock will arrive shortly." "Police?" Lady Alina's voice rose slightly. "Surely that's premature. Mightn't the professor have had some underlying heart condition we were unaware of?" "The symptoms were highly specific," Dr. Hartley insisted. "And given Montgomery's own area of expertise, the coincidence would be remarkable." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only when Carson entered to announce that Inspector Craddock had arrived and was currently examining the greenhouse. "Requests that no one leave the premises," Carson added with appropriate gravity, "and says he will wish to interview each person individually once he has completed his preliminary investigation." "This is absurd," Harold muttered. "I need to speak with Sophia." "Mr. Pemberton," Dr. Hartley said firmly, "the inspector was most specific that everyone should remain here until he has had a chance to assess the situation." "Sophia doesn't even know what's happened," Harold protested. "I've taken the liberty of sending a maid to inform Miss Blackwood," Carson interjected smoothly. "She should be joining us shortly." As if on cue, the door opened once more to admit Sophia, her face pale but composed. "Mother, father, what's happened? Lucy said there's been an accident in the greenhouse." Lord Blackwood rose unsteadily to his feet. "My dear, I'm afraid Professor Montgomery has died under rather unusual circumstances. The police have been called to investigate." Sophia's eyes widened. "Dead? But how?" She broke off, her gaze darting to Harold, then back to her father. "What do you mean, unusual circumstances?" "It appears he may have been poisoned by one of the aconitum specimens," Dr. Hartley explained gently. "Though how the toxin was introduced into his system remains unclear." A flash of something, fear, realization, crossed Sophia's face. "Which specimen?" she asked sharply. "Not the new hybrid in the tropical house?" Lord Blackwood nodded grimly. "The very one. He was particularly interested in its properties. He'd been taking samples all week for his research." "Oh, God," Sophia whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. "I warned him. I told him those gloves weren't adequate for handling the concentrated sap." "You spoke with Professor Montgomery about the aconitum?" I asked quietly, drawing the attention of the room. Sophia looked up, seemingly surprised to find me there. "Yes, yesterday afternoon." He was asking about Father's hybridization techniques, particularly with the more toxic varieties. I mentioned that Father had developed a special protocol for the new strain because its toxicity is significantly higher than standard aconitum. And yet he chose to handle it with inadequate protection. Dr. Hartley's tone was skeptical. "Lionel could be overconfident," Lord Blackwood said wearily. He prided himself on his careful handling of toxic specimens, but he was also determined to complete his research before departing Thornfield. Further discussion was interrupted by Carson's return. "Inspector Craddock wishes to speak with his lordship and Dr. Hartley immediately," he announced. "He has asked that everyone else remain here until he has completed his preliminary inquiries." As Lord Blackwood and Dr. Hartley departed, an uncomfortable silence descended upon the drawing-room. Lady Alina rang for fresh tea, though I doubted anyone had much appetite for refreshments under the circumstances. Sophia sat rigidly in her chair, her face a mask of controlled distress, while Harold paced restlessly by the windows. Dolly, uncharacteristically subdued, moved to sit beside me on the sofa. "What do you make of it, Jane?" she whispered. "Surely it must be a dreadful accident. The alternative is too horrible to contemplate." "I think," I replied carefully, "that we should withhold judgment until the inspector has gathered more information. Appearances can be most deceiving in matters like these. But if it wasn't an accident," Dolly left the implication hanging, "then someone in this house had both the knowledge and the opportunity to ensure that Professor Montgomery would not complete his research," I finished quietly. A troubling prospect indeed. As twilight descended over Thornfield's gardens, casting long shadows across the lawns and transforming the glasshouses into glittering jewel boxes in the fading light, I found myself reflecting on Sophia's nocturnal visit and her fears regarding her father. Had Professor Montgomery indeed discovered evidence of someone slowly poisoning Lord Blackwood? And if so, had that same person silenced him before he could reveal his findings? The drawing-room door opened once more, admitting Inspector Craddock, a tall, lean man with greying hair and the shrewd eyes of one who has seen the darker side of human nature. Behind him came Lord Blackwood and Dr. Hartley, both looking grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," the inspector began without preamble, "I regret to inform you that this appears to be a case of deliberate poisoning. Professor Montgomery did not die from accidental contact with the plant he was examining. Rather, evidence suggests he ingested a concentrated extract of aconitine sometime within the hour before his death." A collective gasp ran through the room. Lady Alina pressed a handkerchief to her lips, while Sophia's face drained of what little colour it had retained. "Ingested?" Harold repeated incredulously. "Are you suggesting he deliberately poisoned himself?" Inspector Craddock's expression remained impassive. "That seems unlikely, given the circumstances. Professor Montgomery was in good health, professionally successful, and actively engaged in research he considered important. No, Mr. Pemberton, I believe we are looking at a case of murder." The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. Murder, Lady Elena echoed faintly. In Thornfield, Inspector, that's simply not possible. I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise, my lady, Craddock replied firmly. A partially empty teacup was found near the body, and preliminary tests indicate the presence of aconitine in the remaining liquid. The professor's symptoms and the rapidity of his death are consistent with a substantial dose of the toxin. But who would want to kill him? Dolly asked, her voice trembling slightly. And why? The inspector's gaze swept the room. That is precisely what I intend to discover. I'll be interviewing each of you individually, beginning immediately. I must ask that no one leaves Thornfield until further notice. My officers are securing the premises, particularly the greenhouses where various toxic substances are apparently readily available. Lord Blackwood bristled visibly at this. Inspector, my botanical collection is maintained with the strictest safety protocols. Access to the more dangerous specimens is carefully controlled. And yet, Craddock observed dryly, someone managed to obtain enough aconitine to kill Professor Montgomery quite efficiently. I'll begin with you, Lord Blackwood, if you please. We can use your study for privacy. As Lord Blackwood led the inspector from the room, I couldn't help but notice the look that passed between Lady Elena and Dr. Hartley, a fleeting exchange that spoke volumes about shared apprehension. Sophia, too, seemed unusually agitated, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt as she stared unseeingly at the carpet. This is a nightmare, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone in the room. Everything is falling apart. Harold moved to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder that she neither leaned into nor shrugged off. Try to stay calm, he murmured. We've done nothing wrong. His choice of words struck me as curious. Not you've done nothing wrong, but we've done nothing wrong, implying some shared secret or circumstance that might appear suspicious to the investigating officers. As darkness fell completely outside the windows and Carson entered to draw the curtains and light the lamps, I found myself observing each person in the room with new attention to detail. One of them, perhaps more than one, knew exactly how Professor Montgomery had come to ingest a fatal dose of aconitine on this particular afternoon. The question was, who had the most compelling reason to silence him permanently? Was it Lord Blackwood, desperate to prevent the professor from revealing something about Dr. Palmer's death, or his own unethical research practices? Lady Elena, protecting her husband from accusations of murder, or perhaps eliminating a threat to her own position? Dr. Hartley, whose long-standing attachment to Lady Elena might be jeopardized by whatever the professor had discovered. Sophia, terrified that Montgomery had evidence of her father's crimes, or perhaps her own. Or Harold Pemberton, whose financial interest in the Thornfield estate might be threatened by scandal. As I pondered these possibilities, I recalled something Professor Montgomery had said during tea on my first day at Thornfield. The duality fascinates. The same plant that can induce fatal respiratory paralysis might also, in different hands, relieve the symptoms of asthma. It all depends on who is administering the dose, and why. How prophetic those words had proven to be. Now, surrounded by the tense, fearful occupants of Thornfield Hall, I wondered if I might identify the hands that had administered the fatal dose, and more crucially, the motive that had guided them, before another death occurred among the deadly blooms of Lord Blackwood's remarkable garden. Chapter 5. Shadows among the flowers. The hours that followed Professor Montgomery's death transformed the elegant calm of Thornfield Hall into a scene of barely contained chaos. Inspector Craddock and his officers moved methodically through the house and gardens, securing potential evidence and interviewing staff members, while we, the house guests and family, waited with varying degrees of patience for our individual interrogations. Lord Blackwood emerged from his interview looking drawn and weary, nodding curtly to his wife, before retreating to his study with a decanter of brandy. Lady Elena was summoned next, her aristocratic composure slipping only slightly as she followed a uniformed constable from the drawing-room. "This is intolerable," Harold muttered once she had gone, pacing the length of the room with restless energy. Being treated like suspects in our own home. It's hardly your home yet, Sophia observed with a brittle edge to her voice. Harold turned to her, his expression darkening. Is this really the time for such distinctions, Sophia? A man is dead, and the police seem determined to pin it on one of us. Not necessarily, I interjected mildly. The inspector is simply being thorough as he should be. Harold's gaze snapped to me, as if suddenly remembering my presence. And what do you make of all this, Miss Marple? You've been observing us all rather keenly since your arrival. Something in his tone, a hint of accusation, perhaps, caught my attention. I'm merely concerned, Mr. Pemberton. Professor Montgomery's death is a terrible tragedy, particularly coming just before what should have been a joyous celebration. Jane has a knack for understanding these situations, Dolly added, with what I feared was excessive enthusiasm given the circumstances. She's helped solve several mysteries in St. Mary Mead. Dolly, please, I demurred. A few village puzzlements hardly qualify me to assist in a police investigation. Sophia leaned forward in her chair, eyes suddenly intent upon me. Is that true? You've helped solve murders before. Nothing so dramatic, I assured her, though in truth, my experiences in St. Mary Mead and beyond had indeed included several homicides. Merely minor village mysteries, missing items, unexplained occurrences. Dolly exaggerates my modest insights. Before Sophia could press further, Carson entered to inform her that Inspector Craddock requested her presence. As she rose to follow him, Harold made as if to accompany her, but she shook her head firmly. The inspector wants to see us individually, she reminded him. I'll be fine, Harold. I have nothing to hide. The slight emphasis she placed on these last words hung in the air after her departure, leaving an uncomfortable silence in the drawing-room. Drink, Miss Marple, Harold offered suddenly, moving to the drinks cabinet and pouring himself what appeared to be a generous measure of whiskey. No, thank you, I replied. But don't let me prevent you from steadying your nerves, Mr. Pemberton. He shot me a sharp look, then gave a short, humorless laugh. My nerves are perfectly steady, I assure you. I merely find this situation frustrating. You and Sophia seem to be under particular strain, I observed, beyond what one might expect from the circumstances. Harold took a substantial swallow of his whiskey before replying. Our engagement has not been without its complications, as I'm sure you've noticed. The Blackwoods are an old family with traditional expectations. Industrial money like mine is necessary but not entirely welcome. Yet Lord Blackwood supported the match, I understand. Richard is a pragmatist, Harold acknowledged. The estate needs capital to maintain those precious greenhouses of his. Elena was less enthusiastic, had her heart set on a title for Sophia, I believe. And Sophia herself. I prompted gently. He stared into his glass for a long moment. Sophia is complex, more so than I initially realized. She agreed to the marriage readily enough when it was first proposed. It's only recently that she's become distant. Since Professor Montgomery's arrival, perhaps, I suggested. Harold's eyes narrowed. You are observant, aren't you? Yes, Sophia has been particularly tense since the professor came to Thornfield. Something about his research seemed to disturb her deeply, though she wouldn't confide in me about it. He drained his glass and set it down with deliberate care. I had hoped that once the engagement celebration was over and we'd returned to Manchester, she might leave behind whatever shadows haunt her here. And now a man is dead. The police are treating us all as suspects, and tomorrow's garden party will almost certainly be cancelled. Not the most auspicious beginning to a marriage, wouldn't you say? Before I could respond, the door opened to admit Dr. Hartley, returning from his interview with Inspector Craddock. His normally composed professional demeanor seemed strained, a faint sheen of perspiration visible on his forehead despite the mild evening temperature. Hartley, Harold acknowledged with a nod. How did it go? As well as could be expected, the doctor replied, accepting the whiskey Harold offered. The inspector is thorough, I'll give him that, particularly interested in my assessment of Montgomery's symptoms and the timeline of his collapse. And your medical relationship with the household, I added quietly, Given your long-standing role as family physician, Dr. Hartley's gaze fixed on me with new intensity. Yes, that too. The inspector seems quite interested in everyone's connections to the family. He took a sip of his whiskey. He'll want to speak with you eventually, Miss Marple. I believe he's working through the immediate household members first. Naturally, I agreed. Though I have little to contribute, having only arrived yesterday. Sometimes a fresh perspective is valuable, he observed. Someone who notices details that residents have become blind to through familiarity. Our conversation was interrupted by Carson's return. Mr. Pemberton, the inspector will see you now. As Harold departed, Dr. Hartley moved to sit nearer to Dolly and me. This is a dreadful business, he said in a low voice. Montgomery wasn't a particularly likable man, but to be murdered in such a way. The inspector is certain it was murder then, Dolly asked. Not some terrible accident or suicide. Quite certain, Dr. Hartley confirmed grimly. The aconitine was administered in his tea, a cup he accepted from someone he trusted enough to drink from without suspicion. Accident and suicide have been ruled out. How dreadful, Dolly murmured. But who would do such a thing, and why? Dr. Hartley's expression grew guarded. I couldn't possibly speculate, though Montgomery did have a talent for making enemies with his insinuations. About Lord Blackwood's research, I suggested. The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly. You seem remarkably well informed, Miss Marple. Merely observant, I replied mildly. Professor made several comments that suggested he harbored suspicions about Lord Blackwood's work, particularly regarding the death of his former research partner. Ridiculous allegations, Dr. Hartley said sharply. Edwin Palmer died of heart failure. I attended him myself in his final hours. There was nothing suspicious about it. Yet Professor Montgomery seemed to believe otherwise, I noted. Enough to travel to Thornfield and conduct his own investigation under the guise of botanical research. Dr. Hartley stared at me for a long moment. You're rather more than the harmless village spinster you appear to be, aren't you, Miss Marple? Jane has a positively uncanny ability to see through people, Dolly said proudly. Remember that business with Colonel Prothero's murder and the vicarage affair. She had it all worked out long before the police. Dolly, please, I protested, though in truth, her words were not entirely inaccurate. I simply observe and draw connections based on human nature, which is remarkably consistent in its frailties, regardless of setting. And what have you observed at Thornfield? Dr. Hartley inquired, his tone carefully neutral. A household under considerable strain, I replied truthfully. Multiple tensions intersecting, financial pressures, an arranged marriage, long-standing emotional attachments, scientific rivalries, and now a death that threatens to expose whatever secrets have been so carefully preserved. The doctor's face paled slightly. You make us sound like characters in a lurid novel, Miss Marple. Not at all, I assured him. Merely human beings caught in circumstances that bring out both the best and worst in our natures. I've seen similar dynamics in the most seemingly ordinary village settings. Our conversation was cut short by the return of Sophia, her interview with Inspector Craddock apparently concluded. She looked exhausted, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes, but she held herself with determined composure as she rejoined us. The inspector wishes to speak with you next, Miss Marple, she announced. Apparently, your reputation has preceded you. Seemed quite interested when I mentioned your experience with village mysteries. I sighed inwardly at Dolly's well-intentioned but inconvenient championing of my modest investigative skills. I'm happy to assist in any way I can, though I fear the inspector may be disappointed. As Carson led me to Lord Blackwood's study, where Inspector Craddock had established his temporary headquarters, I found myself mentally reviewing everything I had observed and overheard since my arrival at Thornfield. The pieces were beginning to align in a troubling pattern, though several crucial elements remained obscure. The study was a handsome room, lined with bookshelves containing leather-bound botanical texts and specimen cases displaying pressed plants behind glass. Inspector Craddock sat behind Lord Blackwood's massive oak desk, while a young constable stood ready with notebook and pencil to record my statement. "Miss Marple," the inspector greeted me, rising politely. "Thank you for your patience. I understand from Miss Blackwood that you have some experience with criminal investigations." "Nothing so formal, Inspector," I demurred, taking the seat he indicated. "Merely an occasional involvement in local puzzlements. Village life can be more eventful than one might expect." "So I've heard," he replied, with the faintest hint of a smile. "Nevertheless, I'd value your impressions of Thornfield and its residents, given your unique perspective." "I've only been here since yesterday," I reminded him. "Hardly sufficient time to form thorough assessments." "Yet I suspect you've observed more in 24 hours than many might notice in a month," he countered. "Miss Blackwood mentioned that you've been taking a particular interest in the family dynamics." I considered how best to respond. "I've certainly noticed certain tension. The upcoming engagement celebration has created pressures, naturally, and Professor Montgomery's presence seemed to add additional strain." "In what way?" "His research interests appeared to concern Lord Blackwood," I explained carefully. "There were references to a previous collaboration and a deceased colleague that suggested some unresolved issues between them." "Dr. Edwin Palmer," Craddock nodded. "Yes, we're looking into that connection." "Did Professor Montgomery discuss his theories about Dr. Palmer's death with you directly?" "No," I replied, though he made several oblique comments about botanical poisons being used in seemingly natural deaths. It seemed to discomfort several members of the household. "I imagine it would," the inspector remarked dryly, "especially if there was any truth to his suspicions." "Was there?" I asked quietly. Inspector Craddock studied me thoughtfully before responding. "We've requested Dr. Palmer's medical records and are considering whether exhumation might be warranted, but that's a separate investigation. For now, my concern is Professor Montgomery's murder, and it was murder, Miss Marple. The evidence is quite conclusive." "The tea?" I inquired. He raised an eyebrow. "Word travels quickly. Yes, a concentrated extract of aconitine was added to his tea shortly before his death. The timing suggests it was administered here at Thornfield, most likely by someone he interacted with between luncheon and his final visit to the greenhouse." "Which would include most of the household," I observed. "Indeed. Lord and Lady Blackwood, Miss Blackwood, Mr. Pemberton, Dr. Hartley, and various staff members all had opportunity. The question is motive and knowledge. Aconitine is a highly specific poison, requiring both access to the plant material and the expertise to extract and administer the toxin effectively." "Which narrows your field of suspects considerably," I suggested. "It does," he agreed. "Lord Blackwood, obviously, given his botanical expertise. Miss Blackwood, who studied botany at university. Dr. Hartley, who would have medical knowledge of plant toxins. And possibly Professor Montgomery himself, though I find suicide highly unlikely given the circumstances." "What about Lady Alina or Mr. Pemberton?" I inquired. "Might they have acquired the necessary knowledge through proximity to the Blackwoods?" "Possible, but less likely," Craddock conceded. "Lady Alina has shown little interest in her husband." Chapter 6. The engagement celebration, the morning of Sophia Blackwood's engagement celebration, dawned with a crystalline perfection that seemed almost mockingly at odds with the grim circumstances at Thornfield Hall. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom window, illuminating the formal gardens below where gardeners and servants were already busy making final preparations for the afternoon's event. I had slept poorly, my mind occupied with the tangled threads of this increasingly complex situation. Harold Pemberton's nocturnal visit had added yet another layer of concern, though whether his fears for Sophia's safety were justified or merely the product of an overactive imagination remained unclear. Dressing simply in a morning dress of pale blue linen, I made my way downstairs for breakfast, finding the morning room already occupied by Dolly, Dr. Hartley, and Inspector Craddock. The inspector looked as though he too had passed a restless night,
dark circles visible beneath his eyes as he nursed a cup of strong coffee. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted me. "I trust you slept well." "Tolerably," I replied, accepting a cup of tea from the hovering footman, "though the circumstances are hardly conducive to peaceful rest." "Indeed not," Dr. Hartley agreed, his professional demeanor firmly in place despite the early hour. "It seems almost surreal to be proceeding with today's celebration." "A sentiment I share," Inspector Craddock remarked dryly, though Lord Blackwood remains adamant that cancellation would be more disruptive than proceeding as planned. "Where is his lordship this morning?" I inquired, noting his absence from the breakfast table. "In the gardens with Jenkins," Dr. Hartley replied. "Final inspections before the guests arrive. He's always been particular about the presentation of his botanical collections." "And Lady Elena, still in her rooms, I believe," Dolly supplied. "Her maid brought up a tray earlier. The poor woman is quite distraught, though determined to maintain appearances." "And Sophia?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual despite my growing concern about the young woman's welfare. "I haven't seen her this morning," Dr. Hartley said, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Nor Mr. Pemberton, for that matter." Inspector Craddock set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "My constable reports that Miss Blackwood was seen walking in the rose garden at dawn, apparently unable to sleep. Mr. Pemberton joined her briefly before returning to the house." I found the inspector's detailed knowledge of the household's movements both reassuring and slightly unnerving. Clearly, Thornfield was under thorough surveillance, which might deter further violence, or might provoke desperate action from whoever had murdered Professor Montgomery. As we were finishing breakfast, Carson entered to announce that the first delivery vans had arrived with flowers and additional furniture for the garden marquee. The household machinery of grand entertainment was shifting into high gear, seemingly oblivious to the fact that a man had died violently on the premises just hours before. "I should join Richard in the gardens," Dr. Hartley said, rising from the table. "These preparations will tax his strength, and in his current condition—" He trailed off, perhaps realizing he had said more than intended. "His condition," Inspector Craddock prompted sharply. "Has Lord Blackwood been unwell, Doctor?" Dr. Hartley's expression closed immediately. "He's 65, Inspector, with the usual ailments one might expect at that age. Nothing serious, but events like today's naturally require considerable energy." The inspector looked unconvinced, but didn't press further. As Dr. Hartley departed, Craddock turned to me. "Miss Marple, might I have a word in private? There's a matter on which I'd value your perspective." Intrigued, I followed him to a small side parlor off the main corridor, where Sergeant Thompson was waiting with a file of papers. "I've been reviewing Professor Montgomery's notes," Craddock began once the door was closed. "Most are botanical in nature, detailed observations of Lord Blackwood's specimens, comparisons with known varieties, that sort of thing. But interspersed among these technical entries are more personal observations." He handed me a sheet of paper covered in small, precise handwriting. This particular entry caught my attention. It was written 2 days ago. I read the passage carefully. Confirmation today of long-held suspicions. The systematic administration continues, likely in the evening tea ritual. Symptoms classic for low-level aconitine exposure, peripheral numbness, digestive distress, mood fluctuations, cardiac irregularities. Subject appears unaware, attributing symptoms to age and overwork. Administrator must have considerable botanical knowledge and daily access. Narrowed to 3 possibilities, though one seems increasingly likely based on observed behaviors and historical precedent. Will confront EP tomorrow after final confirmation. Justice for RB demands nothing less. "EP," I murmured, looking up at the inspector. "Edwin Palmer," Craddock shook his head. "That was my first thought, but Palmer has been dead for 2 years. More likely it refers to a living person at Thornfield, someone whose initials are EP, Elena Pemberton," I suggested. "Lady Blackwood?" "Precisely," he agreed grimly. And RB would be Richard Blackwood. The implication seems clear. Montgomery believed Lady Blackwood was slowly poisoning her husband and planned to confront her about it. But that makes little sense, I objected. Why would Lady Alina poison her husband? By all accounts, their marriage has been stable, if not particularly passionate. She would lose her position and security if he died. Unless there's an inheritance arrangement we're not aware of, Sergeant Thompson suggested. Or perhaps some other motive entirely, revenge, jealousy, or protection of someone else. I considered this carefully. What about Dr. Hartley? His relationship with Lady Alina seems to go beyond the strictly professional. Could they be conspirators? It's a possibility we're investigating, Craddock acknowledged, though it still doesn't explain Lady Alina's motive for harming her husband. And what of Miss Blackwood? I asked. She confided to me that she feared someone was poisoning her father, though she didn't specifically accuse her mother. The inspector's eyebrows rose. She confided this to you, when? The night of my arrival, I admitted. She came to my room quite distressed, expressing concern about her father's symptoms and the possibility that Professor Montgomery had discovered evidence of poisoning. Yet she didn't share these concerns with me during our interview, Craddock noted, his expression darkening. That's a significant omission. She's in a difficult position, I pointed out, torn between loyalty to her family and fear for her father's welfare. And now, with Professor Montgomery's murder, she may be frightened for her own safety as well. With good reason, the inspector said grimly. If she suspects her mother of poisoning Lord Blackwood, and if Lady Alina murdered Montgomery to prevent exposure, then Miss Blackwood could indeed be in danger, especially if she shared her suspicions with anyone else. Such as her fiancé, I suggested, thinking of Harold's nocturnal visit to my room. Exactly. Which brings us to another curious circumstance, this rushed engagement between Miss Blackwood and Mr. Pemberton. The timing seems significant, coinciding with the worsening of Lord Blackwood's condition. And now, despite a murder on the premises, they're proceeding with today's celebration as if nothing has happened. I shared Harold's account of the arranged nature of the engagement and the financial terms that heavily favored the Blackwoods. It seems more a business merger than a love match, I concluded. Though Mr. Pemberton appears to have developed genuine feelings for Miss Blackwood, or wants us to believe he has, Craddock said skeptically. He stands to gain considerable social advancement through this marriage, even with the financial burden it places on his family. What will you do now, Inspector? I inquired. Will you confront Lady Alina with Professor Montgomery's notes? He sighed, running a hand through his greying hair. Not immediately. Without more concrete evidence, an accusation of that magnitude against a woman of her standing would be problematic. For now, I'll continue gathering information while maintaining close observation of the household, particularly during today's event. A wise approach, I agreed, though I fear the celebration may provide opportunities for further harm if the responsible party feels cornered. Which is why I've stationed officers throughout the grounds and house, he assured me. No one will have the opportunity to act without being observed. As I returned to my room to change for the garden party, I couldn't help but wonder if such precautions would be sufficient. Someone in this household had already demonstrated both the knowledge and the ruthlessness to commit murder once. Would the presence of police and dozens of guests deter them from striking again if they felt threatened? Or might the chaos of the celebration provide the perfect cover for another deadly act among Thornfield's beautiful but lethal blooms? By 2 o'clock, Thornfield Hall had transformed from a house of mourning and suspicion into a scene of elegant festivity, at least on the surface. The formal gardens sparkled in the afternoon sunlight, with white-clothed tables arranged beneath flowering cherry trees, a string quartet playing softly in the gazebo, and liveried footmen circulating with trays of champagne and delicate canapés. I had dressed with particular care in my best afternoon ensemble, a lavender silk dress with matching jacket that Raymond had sent from London for my last birthday. Dolly, resplendent in a floral print, that somewhat overwhelmed her small frame, accompanied me onto the main terrace where Lord and Lady Blackwood were greeting the first arriving guests. Lady Alina had achieved a remarkable transformation since breakfast, her earlier distress now concealed beneath flawless makeup and social poise. She wore an elegant tea gown of silver-grey silk that complemented her still handsome features, while Lord Blackwood stood beside her in a perfectly tailored morning suit, looking every inch the aristocratic country gentleman despite the subtle tremor in his right hand as he shook hands with each arrival. Sophia and Harold had taken positions slightly apart from her parents, forming a second receiving line for those specifically offering congratulations on their engagement. Sophia wore a pale green dress that emphasized her youth and the delicate bone structure she had inherited from her mother. She smiled and thanked each well-wisher with practiced grace, though I noted the tension in her posture and the wary glances she occasionally directed toward her mother. Inspector Craddock and Sergeant Thompson had stationed themselves strategically near the terrace steps, dressed in civilian clothes, but unmistakably alert. Other police officers, similarly attired, were positioned throughout the gardens, watching the growing crowd of elegantly dressed guests with professional detachment. "Isn't this lovely?" Dolly enthused as we accepted champagne from a passing footman. One would never know there had been a tragedy just yesterday. The Blackwoods certainly know how to maintain appearances. "Perhaps too well," I murmured, my gaze tracking Dr. Hartley as he moved through the crowd, stopping frequently to check on Lord Blackwood with a concern that seemed more than merely professional. As the gardens filled with guests, aristocratic neighbors, botanical enthusiasts from London, business associates of the Pemberton family, I maintained a careful watch on the principal players in our unfolding drama. Lady Alina moved among her guests with practiced charm, though she kept a noticeable distance from her daughter and future son-in-law. Lord Blackwood alternated between animated discussions with Chapter 7. Truth among the thorns. The hours following Sophia's death transformed Thornfield Hall from a scene of celebration to one of grief and suspicion. As evening fell, the gardens that had earlier sparkled with champagne flutes and ladies' summer hats now stood eerily empty, the decorations for the aborted engagement party still hanging like discordant notes in a funeral dirge. Inspector Craddock had established a formal incident room in the library, where he and his officers methodically compiled evidence and interviewed staff members. I had been asked to remain available, though not confined to any particular area of the house, a courtesy that allowed me to observe the household's responses to this second shocking death. Lord Blackwood remained sedated in his bedroom, attended by a nurse summoned from the village hospital. Lady Alina had recovered from her initial collapse and was now secluded in her sitting room, having refused further medical attention from Dr. Hartley, a telling detail that had not escaped my notice. The doctor himself seemed deeply shaken, his professional demeanor cracking to reveal genuine distress as he moved between attending to Lord Blackwood and consulting with the police. Harold Pemberton had been persuaded to rest in his room after giving his formal statement, though the footman stationed outside his door suggested the inspector was taking no chances with the volatile young man's grief-stricken accusation. Dolly found me in the conservatory, where I had retreated to gather my thoughts amid the neutral territory of ferns and palms that had no connection to the deadly specimens in Lord Blackwood's specialized collections. "Oh, Jane," she exclaimed in a hushed voice, sinking onto the wicker chair beside me. "What a dreadful, dreadful business. That poor girl, and on what should have been her celebration day. I can scarcely believe it." "It is indeed tragic," I agreed, noting Dolly's genuine distress. For all her occasional frivolity, she had a kind heart and felt others' sorrows keenly. "Inspector Craddock has asked us not to leave before tomorrow at the earliest," she continued, "though I can't imagine staying in this house a moment longer than necessary. There's a darkness here, Jane, beneath all the beauty. I felt it from the first day, though I couldn't have imagined how it would manifest. You were more perceptive than you knew." I acknowledged. Though I suspect even now we haven't seen the full extent of that darkness. Dolly shivered despite the conservatory's warmth. What do you mean? Surely, with 2 murders, we've seen the worst that could happen. Perhaps, I said, though without conviction. But the central mystery remains unsolved. Who has been poisoning Lord Blackwood, if indeed that's what's happening? And how does that connect to the deaths of Professor Montgomery and Sophia? You believe they're all linked? That the same person is responsible for everything? I considered the question carefully. Not necessarily. In fact, I'm increasingly convinced that we may be dealing with multiple threads of deception that have become tangled in unexpected ways. Before I could elaborate, Carson appeared at the conservatory door, his usual dignity somewhat diminished by the strain of recent events. "Excuse me, Miss Marple. Inspector Craddock requests your presence in the library as soon as convenient." "Of course," I rose immediately. "I'll come right away." "I'll join you," Dolly declared, clearly unwilling to be left alone in any part of Thornfield Hall. The library presented a stark contrast to the peaceful conservatory. Maps of the estate were spread across Lord Blackwood's massive desk, while photographs of both crime scenes had been pinned to a makeshift board. Inspector Craddock looked up from a document he was reviewing as we entered. "Ah, Miss Marple, thank you for coming so promptly." He nodded a brief acknowledgement to Dolly. "Mrs. Bantry, have you made progress, Inspector?" I inquired, noting the focused energy in the room despite the late hour. "Some," he admitted, though each answer seems to generate additional questions. He gestured to a pair of chairs. "Please, sit down. What I'm about to share is confidential, but given your involvement from the beginning, I believe your insights may prove valuable." Once we were seated, Craddock continued. "The initial toxicology tests on samples from Miss Blackwood's body suggest she was poisoned with a concentrated extract of Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, likely administered within 30 minutes of her death." "Administered how?" I asked, recalling no signs of forced ingestion or injection. "That's one of our puzzles," Craddock acknowledged. "No food or drink containers were found near the body, and Dr. Hartley observed no injection marks during his preliminary examination. However, he did note a peculiar scent on her hands, a floral fragrance that seemed out of place in the herb garden." "Perfume," Dolly suggested. "Possibly," the inspector agreed. "Though not a commercial scent according to our female officers, something more botanical in nature." "Absorption through the skin," I murmured, pieces beginning to align in my mind. "Certain alkaloids can enter the bloodstream that way, particularly if the skin is abraded or the compound is mixed with a carrier that enhances penetration." Craddock looked at me with renewed interest. "That's precisely what our forensic expert suggested. A handkerchief or gloves impregnated with the toxin, perhaps, which Miss Blackwood handled unwittingly." "Or a cosmetic item," I suggested, remembering the scattered contents of Sophia's beaded bag. "Her compact or lipstick, substituted for her own or doctored in some way. We're testing the items from her bag," Craddock confirmed. "Though the most likely vehicle, the mysterious notebook she claimed to have found, is still missing." "Assuming it existed at all," Dolly interjected, "might the poor girl have imagined it in her distress?" "That's certainly possible," the inspector conceded. "However, we've now discovered something that lends credence to Miss Blackwood's claims." He extracted a folder from beneath the estate maps. "Our officers conducted a thorough search of Lady Alina's rooms following Sophia's death. They found this concealed beneath a false bottom in her jewelry box." He opened the folder to reveal several pages of handwritten notes, filled with what appeared to be a combination of botanical symbols, chemical formulas, and cryptic abbreviation. "It's not a complete notebook," Craddock explained, "but rather loose pages that may have been removed from a bound volume. The writing matches samples we've obtained of Lady Alina's hand, though she denies any knowledge of these documents." I studied the pages with keen interest, noting the precise notation and meticulous attention to detail. Each entry included dates, measurements in minuscule quantities, and observations labeled with abbreviated terms that I recognized from botanical literature. These appear to be records of systematic administration of plant-derived compounds, I observed. The notations suggest careful titration of dosages, with adjustments based on observed effects. Precisely our interpretation, Craddock agreed grimly. And the dates correspond to the progression of Lord Blackwood's illness, as described by household staff and Dr. Hartley. Then Lady Alina has indeed been poisoning her husband, Dolly concluded, her expression horrified. And killed both Professor Montgomery and Sophia when they discovered the evidence. That would be the obvious conclusion, I agreed, though something in my tone must have suggested reservation, for Inspector Craddock looked at me sharply. You have doubts, Miss Marple. Not doubts precisely, I replied carefully, but questions that don't quite align with that theory. For instance, why would Lady Alina keep such incriminating evidence rather than destroying it once she realized Montgomery was suspicious? And why proceed with today's celebration knowing that Sophia had searched her room and potentially discovered these pages? Overconfidence, perhaps, Craddock suggested. Or she may not have realized that Sophia had found anything incriminating. There's also the question of motive, I continued. What would Lady Alina gain from her husband's slow poisoning? Not freedom from an unhappy marriage. They've been together for decades without scandal. Not financial benefit. The estate would pass to Sophia upon Lord Blackwood's death. Unless she intended to eliminate Sophia as well, the inspector countered. Which, it appears, she ultimately did. Perhaps, I acknowledged, though that brings us to another inconsistency. If Lady Alina wished to disinherit Sophia in favor of, say, a charitable foundation or distant relative, why arrange the engagement to Harold Pemberton? Why consolidate Sophia's position through marriage to a wealthy industrialist who could potentially secure Thornfield's future? Craddock frowned, considering these points. What alternative theory are you suggesting, Miss Marple? I'm not yet ready to propose a specific alternative, I admitted. But I believe we should consider carefully whether these pages might represent something other than a poisoner's log, or whether they might have been placed in Lady Alina's jewelry box by someone wishing to direct suspicion toward her. That seems rather far-fetched, Dolly objected. Who would go to such lengths? Someone with as much to lose as Lady Alina has, I suggested. Someone who understood the botanical significance of these notes and could convincingly forge her handwriting. Before Inspector Craddock could respond, a constable entered with a message that Dr. Hartley urgently requested the inspector's presence in Lord Blackwood's room. Rising quickly, Craddock asked us to remain in the library until his return, then departed with the constable. Jane, Dolly said once we were alone, you can't seriously believe Lady Alina is innocent. Everything points to her guilt. Her relationship with Dr. Hartley, her coolness toward Sophia, her knowledge of her husband's routines and access to his food and drink. I'm merely suggesting that we consider all possibilities before reaching conclusions, I replied. In my experience, the most obvious solution is rarely the correct one in cases of this complexity. We fell silent, contemplating the grim evidence spread across the library table. After several minutes, my attention was drawn to a detail in one of the cryptic entries, a notation that seemed oddly familiar. EP, I murmured, leaning closer to examine the page. That abbreviation appears repeatedly in the later entries. Edwin Palmer, Dolly suggested, recalling our earlier discussions. But he's been dead for 2 years. Exactly, I agreed, something clicking into place in my mind. And yet these notes, which supposedly document the recent poisoning of Lord Blackwood, reference EP repeatedly. Why would Lady Alina include coded references to a dead man in her poisoning records? Before Dolly could respond, hurried footsteps in the corridor heralded Inspector Craddock's return. His expression was grave as he re-entered the library. Lord Blackwood's condition has deteriorated dramatically, he announced without preamble. Dr. Hartley believes he's experiencing acute poisoning symptoms, far more severe than the chronic low-level exposure previously suspected. Good heavens, Dolly exclaimed. Is he? He's still alive, but critical, Craddock replied tersely. The doctor is doing what he can, but without knowing the exact toxin involved, treatment options are limited. He's particularly concerned by the sudden acceleration, as if someone has administered a much larger dose than previously. Or a different compound entirely, I suggested. One designed to mimic the earlier symptoms but act more rapidly. Craddock nodded grimly. Dr. Hartley suggested the same possibility. He's sending blood samples to the county hospital for immediate analysis, but results will take hours. Where is Lady Alina now? I inquired, suddenly alert to new possibilities. In her sitting room, as far as I know. I've stationed a constable outside her door with instructions not to allow her near her husband under any circumstances. He ran a hand through his graying hair, a rare gesture of frustration from the normally composed officer. If she is responsible for the systematic poisoning, this final, potentially lethal dose suggests desperation, an attempt to complete her plan before our investigation can prove her guilt. Or, I said quietly, it suggests someone else entirely is taking advantage of the circumstances to eliminate Lord Blackwood while ensuring Lady Alina takes the blame. Inspector Craddock studied me intently. You have a specific suspect in mind, don't you, Miss Marple? I have a theory, I acknowledged, based on certain inconsistencies that have troubled me from the beginning, but I need to confirm one crucial detail. I rose from my chair. May I visit Lord Blackwood's room? There's something I need to observe firsthand. After a moment's hesitation, Craddock nodded. Very well, but I'll accompany you, and we'll avoid interfering with Dr. Hartley's treatment. We proceeded to Lord Blackwood's bedroom, located in the east wing of the house. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the night. Dr. Hartley stood beside the massive four-poster bed, checking his patient's pulse with a grave expression. Lord Blackwood lay unnaturally still, his breathing shallow and labored, his complexion waxy in the lamplight. Any change, Doctor? Craddock inquired softly. Dr. Hartley shook his head. His respiration is increasingly compromised, and his heart rhythm is erratic. I've administered atropine as an antidote, but without knowing precisely what we're dealing with. He trailed off, his medical training clearly warring with his emotional connection to the patient. I moved closer to the bed, observing not just Lord Blackwood, but the surrounding environment, the medicine bottles on the nightstand, the half-empty water carafe, the botanical prints adorning the walls. One detail in particular caught my attention, a delicate porcelain tea service on a small table by the window, including a single used cup with a residue of dark liquid in its bottom. His evening tea, Dr. Hartley explained, following my gaze. It's part of his nightly ritual, a special herbal blend that Lady Alina prepares personally. He always takes it here alone before retiring. And tonight, I prompted, did he follow this ritual despite the day's tragic events? Yes, the doctor confirmed. Carson brought the tray up shortly after 8 o'clock, as usual. Lord Blackwood insisted on maintaining routine despite his distress over Sophia's death, said it was the only thing keeping him sane. I approached the tea service, noting the distinctive fragrance that still emanated from the pot, herbal, certainly, but with undertones I couldn't immediately identify. Has this been tested? I asked Craddock. Samples have been taken, he confirmed. We're testing everything Lord Blackwood has consumed today. And who has had access to his room since the tea was brought up? I continued, pieces falling rapidly into place in my mind. Lady Alina visited briefly around 9, Dr. Hartley supplied. Then I came to check on him at 9:30 when the first severe symptoms began. Carson has been in and out with fresh water and towels, no one else to my knowledge. I turned to Inspector Craddock, my decision made. I believe I know who is responsible for all 3 poisonings, Professor Montgomery, Sophia, and now the attempt on Lord Blackwood. But to prove it, we need to search one more location. Where? He asked immediately. Dr. Hartley's medical bag, I replied, meeting the doctor's startled gaze directly. And his room's here at Thornfield. I believe we'll find both the missing notebook Sophia discovered and the concentrated botanical toxins used in all 3 poisonings. Dr. Hartley's face drained of color, but he recovered quickly, summoning a convincing expression of indignation. This is outrageous. I've been treating Lord Blackwood, not poisoning him. Actually, I said quietly, I believe you've been doing both, Doctor. Administering carefully calculated doses of aconitine and other plant-derived toxins over many months, while simultaneously treating the resulting symptoms as natural ailments. A perfect cover, until Professor Montgomery began to suspect the truth. This is absurd, Dr. Hartley protested, though I noted the slight tremor in his hands as he placed them in his pockets, away from his medical bag, which sat on a nearby chair. Why would I harm Richard? He's been my patient and friend for decades. Friend, yes, I agreed, but also the man who took credit for research that wasn't entirely his own. The man who built his reputation on botanical discoveries that rightfully belonged to your brother-in-law, Edwin Palmer. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Dr. Hartley stared at me, his professional mask slipping to reveal shock beneath. How did you? The notations in the so-called poisoning log, I explained. EP doesn't refer to Edwin Palmer directly, but to his research, plant compounds he discovered but never received recognition for. You weren't creating a record of your poisoning activities. You were systematically testing Palmer's theories about plant-derived toxins on the man who had appropriated his work. Inspector Craddock looked between us, following the logic of my deduction. Palmer was your brother-in-law. My wife's brother, Dr. Hartley acknowledged, his composure crumbling. A brilliant botanist whose work Richard Blackwood systematically stole and published under his own name. Edwin died believing his life's work had been attributed to another man, his legacy erased. So you decided to take revenge, I continued gently. Not with a quick, obvious murder that might raise suspicions, but with a slow, methodical poisoning using the very compounds Edwin had discovered. A poetic justice that would eventually kill Richard while simultaneously proving the efficacy of Edwin's research. You can't prove any of this, Dr. Hartley said, though without conviction. It's speculation. Perhaps, Inspector Craddock interjected, but a search of your rooms and medical supplies would likely provide concrete evidence. And there's still the matter of Professor Montgomery and Miss Blackwood's murders. Montgomery was getting too close to the truth, I suggested, watching Dr. Hartley's face for confirmation. He recognized the poisoning symptoms from his own research into botanical toxins. He confronted you, didn't he? Not Lord Blackwood as everyone assumed. The doctor's shoulders sagged, the fight visibly leaving him. He found me in the tropical house that afternoon, told me he'd figured it all out, not just Richard's condition, but my connection to Edwin. Said he had a moral obligation to expose the truth. A bitter smile crossed his face. Moral obligation. Where was his moral outrage when Richard was stealing Edwin's research? When my brother-in-law died heartbroken and unrecognized? So you poisoned his tea, Craddock stated flatly. A concentrated dose of aconitine that killed him within minutes. It was already prepared, Dr. Hartley admitted quietly. I'd been planning to accelerate Richard's dosage. Montgomery's unexpected confrontation merely changed the intended recipient. And Sophia, I prompted, though I already suspected the answer. That was unplanned, he said, genuine regret crossing his features. He found Edwin's original research notebook in my rooms yesterday, must have been searching for evidence about her father's condition. I discovered it missing this morning, realized she must have taken it. He closed his eyes briefly. I couldn't let her expose everything, not when I was so close to completing what I'd started. So you prepared the belladonna extract, Craddock concluded. Applied it to something she would touch in the herb garden, her own notebook perhaps, or the bench where she waited. Her compact, Dr. Hartley corrected dully. I switched it for an identical one treated with the extract. Knew she would use it before meeting Miss Marple, checking her appearance as young women do. The transdermal absorption would be rapid, but not immediate, allowing me to establish an alibi elsewhere in the gardens. The clinical detachment with which he described Sophia's murder sent a chill through me. This was no longer the dedicated physician I had observed over the past days, but a man consumed by vengeance to the point of calculated homicide. And tonight, I asked, the accelerated dose for Lord Blackwood. What better opportunity than the chaos following Sophia's death? He replied, a hint of his earlier bitterness returning. Everyone would naturally suspect Elena, the grieving mother lashing out at her husband in misplaced rage. The evidence planted in her jewelry box would confirm suspicions. Richard would die, Elena would hang, and Edwin would finally have justice. A justice that required 3 deaths rather than 1, Inspector Craddock observed grimly, and implicated an innocent woman in multiple murders. Elena is hardly innocent, Dr. Hartley countered. She knew what Richard had done to Edwin, knew and remained silent, protecting her husband's reputation while my wife mourned her brother alone. That doesn't justify framing her for murder, Craddock stated firmly. Dr. James Hartley, I am arresting you for the murders of Professor Lionel Montgomery and Miss Sophia Blackwood and the attempted murder of Lord Richard Blackwood. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. As a constable was summoned to take Dr. Hartley into custody, I approached Lord Blackwood's bedside once more. Despite everything we had learned, I felt a surge of professional concern for the stricken man. Will he survive? I asked quietly. Dr. Hartley, now in handcuffs but still a physician at his core, glanced at his patient. Probably, he admitted. The final dose was substantial but not necessarily lethal with proper treatment. I've already administered the appropriate antidote. My aim was not to kill him tonight, merely to ensure that suspicion fell on Elena when he eventually succumbed. A cold comfort, I observed, but better than adding a 3rd death to your conscience. As Dr. Hartley was led away, Inspector Craddock turned to me with genuine admiration. Remarkable deduction, Miss Marple. The connection to Edwin Palmer was the key I was missing. It was the inconsistencies that guided me, I explained. The supposed poisoning log that referenced a dead man. The inexplicable acceleration of Lord Blackwood's symptoms during a police investigation that would likely exonerate him. The curious fact that Dr. Hartley was always the first to diagnose and treat each poisoning, yet never seemed to identify the true cause. Most telling was his insistence on redirecting suspicion toward Lady Elena, despite the illogical nature of her supposed crimes. Well, you've saved Lord Blackwood's life, Craddock acknowledged, and prevented a grievous miscarriage of justice against Lady Elena, though she'll have to be told about Dr. Hartley's true nature, a difficult revelation given their apparent attachment. The truth is rarely comfortable, I agreed, but usually preferable to comforting lies. Lady Elena will survive this, as will Lord Blackwood, I suspect. Whether their marriage recovers is another matter entirely. 3 days later, as Dolly and I prepared to depart Thornfield Hall, I stood once more in the formal gardens, contemplating the beauty that had concealed such deadly purpose. The flowers nodded in the gentle breeze, innocent vehicles for the toxins they naturally produced, toxins that, in Dr. Hartley's hands, had become weapons of calculated revenge. Lord Blackwood was recovering slowly, his system gradually clearing the accumulated poisons of months of exposure. Lady Elena remained by his side, their relationship fundamentally altered by the revelations of Dr. Hartley's crimes and the underlying scientific dispute that had motivated them. Harold Pemberton had returned to Manchester immediately following Sophia's funeral, his grief compounded by the knowledge that her death had been, in many ways, collateral damage in a vendetta that had nothing to do with her. There you are, Miss Marple, Lady Elena's voice interrupted my reverie. I turned to find her approaching along the gravel path, dignified in her deep mourning, her aristocratic composure firmly back in place, despite the shadows beneath her eyes. Lady Elena, I acknowledged with a small nod. I was just bidding farewell to your beautiful gardens before our departure. They seem less beautiful now, she observed, gazing at the immaculate flower beds with a detachment that suggested permanent estrangement from their pleasures. Knowing what James did here, what he used Richard's beloved plants to accomplish. The gardens themselves are innocent, I suggested gently, as were you, despite his attempts to direct suspicion in your direction. She laughed without humor. Am I innocent, Miss Marple? I knew of Richard's academic feud with Edwin Palmer. I suspected the research published under my husband's name wasn't entirely his own. I chose loyalty to Richard over truth, and in doing so, perhaps set in motion the events that led to Sophia's death. Dr. Hartley's actions were his own, I said firmly. Whatever ethical lapses occurred in the academic dispute, nothing justifies the calculated murders he committed. No, she agreed softly. Nothing justifies that. I just wish. She trailed off, staring at a particularly magnificent rose bush laden with deep crimson blooms. I wish I had recognized the darkness in James earlier. I trusted him with my health, with Richard's care, with my private thoughts and feelings. All the while, he was systematically poisoning my husband and planning to frame me for the crime. The most effective deceptions, I observed, are often perpetrated by those closest to us, those we have no reason to suspect of malice. Lady Alina studied me with newfound respect. You saw through the deception when the rest of us were blinded by familiarity and trust. Richard wishes to thank you personally before you leave. He's a bit stronger today, if you wouldn't mind visiting his room. I agreed readily, curious to speak with Lord Blackwood now that he was recovering from both the physical effects of the poisoning and the psychological blow of learning its source. Found him propped up in bed, noticeably frail, but with clear eyes that suggested his mind, at least, was fully restored. Miss Marple, he greeted me, extending a thin hand. I understand I owe you my life. Inspector Craddock has explained how you unraveled James's scheme when everyone else was prepared to believe Alina the culprit. The evidence pointed in multiple directions, I demurred. I merely followed the threads that seemed most consistent with human nature as I've observed it. And observed it keenly from what I gather, he acknowledged. You saw what the rest of us missed, the darkness that had consumed a man I considered both physician and friend for over 30 years. Darkness born of grievance, I noted. Dr. Hartley believed you had stolen his brother-in-law's research and recognition. Was there truth to that accusation? Lord Blackwood's gaze shifted to his wife, then back to me. Some, he admitted with evident difficulty, though not as James believed. Edwin and I collaborated closely for years. Some ideas were his, some mine. The line between our contributions often blurred. When we published, tradition dictated that my name appeared first as the senior researcher and institutional sponsor. But you knew it troubled him, Lady Alina interjected softly. You knew he felt overshadowed, particularly after the monkshood hybridization paper received such acclaim. Yes, Lord Blackwood acknowledged, genuine regret crossing his features. I knew. I intended to correct the imbalance in our next major publication, ensure he received proper credit. But then he died so suddenly, heart failure, we all believed. His expression hardened. Now I wonder if James had begun his poisoning experiments earlier than we realized. It's possible, I agreed, having considered this possibility myself. Dr. Hartley's systematic approach suggests he may have refined his techniques over time, perhaps using Dr. Palmer as his first subject, ensuring his death appeared natural while creating the grievance that would justify his later actions against you. Lord Blackwood closed his eyes briefly, the weight of this possibility clearly paining him. 2 deaths and nearly a third, all stemming from academic attribution. It seems incomprehensible. Human passion takes many forms, I observed. The desire for recognition, for one's life's work to be acknowledged, can be as powerful as any more conventional motive for murder. What will you do now? Lady Alina asked quietly. The gardens hold such terrible memories. Reclaim them, Lord Blackwood replied with unexpected firmness. Honor Sophia's memory by preserving what she loved about Thornfield, and perhaps, he added, glancing at his wife, establish a proper research foundation in both Edwin Palmer's and Sophia's names. Ensure that future botanical work here acknowledges all contributors fairly. It was a fitting tribute, I thought, an attempt to rectify, however belatedly, the injustice that had spawned such deadly consequences. Whether it would heal the wounds between Lord and Lady Blackwood remained to be seen, but it offered at least the possibility of redemption amid tragedy. As Dolly and I departed Thornfield Hall later that morning, I gazed back at the magnificent house with its surrounding gardens. Beauty and danger intertwined, as they so often are in both nature and human relationships. The deadly blooms would continue to flower each spring, their toxic properties unchanged, but perhaps with a new awareness of the thin line between scientific discovery and malevolent application. "What a dreadful business it's been," Dolly remarked as our train pulled away from Thornfield Halt. "I shall never look at a garden quite the same way again." "Perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing," I suggested, my thoughts already turning toward the modest cottage garden awaiting me in St. Mary Mead. A healthy respect for the dual nature of beauty is a valuable lesson, after all. "Trust you to find a moral in such tragedy, Jane," Dolly said with affectionate exasperation. "Though I suppose if one must endure murder investigations, there ought to be some philosophical benefit." I smiled at her practical assessment. The gardens of Thornfield Hall would fade from our immediate concerns as we returned to village life, but the lessons they had taught about vengeance, justice, recognition, and the deadly consequences of buried grievances would remain. Like the toxic plants that had featured so prominently in this case, such lessons were potent medicine when properly understood, and deadly poison when misapplied. In my small notebook, I had recorded the details of the case for future reference, should I ever encounter a similar constellation of human passions and botanical knowledge. For while the specific circumstances of Thornfield Hall might never be repeated, the fundamental nature of the human heart, with its capacity for both brilliant creation and calculated destruction, would certainly manifest again, perhaps in my own village, in some new and equally deadly arrangement of beauty, brilliance, and bitter revenge.